The air was thick with the hum of alien machinery, a symphony of strange sounds that reverberated through the charred remains of the battlefield. The sky above was painted a haunting mix of crimson and violet, courtesy of the warships that hovered ominously, their metallic forms gleaming like celestial predators. Humanity's last line of defense, a ragtag group of soldiers and resistance fighters, had been pushed back to the edge of the ravaged city. Among them was Lieutenant Andrew Carter, his leg bent unnaturally beneath him after a brutal fall during the retreat. Andrew cursed under his breath, sweat matting his dirty blonde hair to his forehead. Every movement sent a sharp bolt of pain up his leg, but he refused to scream. The others needed to focus on survival, not him. Around him, his team scavenged what little ammunition and supplies they could find, preparing for what would likely be their final stand. The enemy, the Cliveth, were unlike anything Earth had ever encountered. Standing nearly 7 feet tall with translucent, chitinous exoskeletons, they moved with an unnerving fluidity. Their technology was light years ahead, capable of devastating cities in minutes. But the most terrifying thing about them wasn't their appearance or weapons. It was their hive-mind intelligence. They operated as a single entity, an unbroken consciousness that adapted to every human tactic with chilling precision. Andrew glanced at the horizon, where the shimmering forms of Cliveth soldiers were advancing in perfect unison. His breath hitched. They were coming, and no amount of human ingenuity seemed capable of stopping them. "Lieutenant, we need to move," barked Sergeant Kira Lang, her voice sharp but tinged with worry. She knelt beside him, her dark eyes scanning his injury. "Can you stand?" Andrew shook his head. "Not a chance. Legs busted. You'll have to leave me." Kira's jaw tightened. "Not an option. It's an order," Andrew snapped, though his voice lacked the bite of authority. He knew Kira wouldn't abandon him. She was too stubborn for that. But time was running out and the Cliveth were closing in. Suddenly, a strange sound echoed through the air. A low, pulsating hum that seemed to resonate deep within their bones. The Cliveth stopped in their tracks, their movements halting as if frozen by some invisible force. The battlefield grew eerily silent, save for the hum, which grew louder and more erratic. Andrew's eyes widened. The Cliveth were retreating? He watched in disbelief as the alien soldiers turned in unison and began to withdraw, their precise ranks dissolving into chaos. "What the hell just happened?" Kira whispered, her gaze darting between Andrew and the retreating enemy. "I have no idea," Andrew admitted, his voice tinged with awe. But deep down, he felt an odd sense of connection to the moment, as if his injury had somehow triggered the shift. It wasn't until later, after the humans had regrouped and taken refuge in an underground bunker, that the truth began to unravel. Among the survivors was Dr. Elena Morozov, a biologist who had been studying the Cliveth since their arrival. She approached Andrew with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, carrying a portable scanner in one hand. "Lieutenant Carter," she began, her Russian accent soft but precise. "May I examine your injury?" Andrew frowned but nodded. "Sure, but I don't see what my leg has to do with anything." As Elena ran the scanner over his broken limb, her expression shifted from confusion to astonishment. "This is extraordinary," she murmured. "What is?" Kira asked, leaning over to peer at the scanner. Elena pointed to the display, which showed an intricate web of neural activity surrounding Andrew's injury. The Cliveth are highly sensitive to electromagnetic fields, especially those generated by biological systems. When a human experiences intense physical trauma, the body emits a unique electromagnetic signal, a sort of distress beacon. For reasons we don't fully understand, this signal interferes with the Cliveth hive mind. Andrew blinked. "You're saying my broken leg scared off an entire alien army?" Not scared, Elena corrected. Disrupted. The Clivith rely on their collective consciousness to function. Your injury created a signal that fragmented their connection, forcing them to retreat. The room fell silent as the weight of Elena's words sank in. Andrew, Kira, and the others exchanged glances, a mixture of disbelief and hope sparking in their eyes. So, what does this mean for us? Andrew asked. It means we have a weapon, Elena said, her voice firm. If we can replicate this signal, we might be able to disrupt the Clivith on a larger scale. But it won't be easy. The signal is tied to human pain and trauma, which presents ethical and practical challenges. Andrew grimaced. You're saying we need to hurt ourselves to win? Elena hesitated. Not necessarily. With the right technology, we could simulate the signal without causing real harm. But we'll need time to develop it, and time is something we don't have much of. Over the next few days, the humans worked tirelessly to devise a way to weaponize the electromagnetic signal. Engineers rigged makeshift devices to amplify and broadcast the frequency, while medics tended to injured soldiers who volunteered to endure controlled pain for testing purposes. Andrew, despite his injury, played a central role in the effort, lending his knowledge of battlefield tactics to coordinate the deployment of the new weapon. When the Clivith launched their next assault, the humans were ready. As the alien soldiers approached, their movements as precise and terrifying as ever, Andrew and his team activated the signal emitters. The effect was instantaneous. The Clivith froze mid-stride, their forms trembling as the hive-mind connection fractured. Some collapsed, their exoskeletons shattering like fragile glass, while others fled in disarray. Cheers erupted among the human ranks as the Clivith retreated once again, their once unstoppable advance reduced to chaos. For the first time since the war began, humanity had a fighting chance. In the aftermath, Andrew sat on the edge of a makeshift cot, his leg in a sturdy brace. Kira approached him, a rare smile gracing her usually stoic features. You did it, she said, clapping him on the shoulder. Your broken leg just turned the tide of the war. Andrew chuckled, though his eyes were weary. Guess I'll have to break the other one next time. Kira laughed, a sound that was equal parts relief and exhaustion. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. As the humans prepared for the battles to come, they knew the war was far from over. But they also knew they had something the Clivith couldn't adapt to, the indomitable spirit of a species that refused to surrender, even in the face of overwhelming odds. And if a broken leg could bring an alien army to its knees, then perhaps humanity's greatest strength lay in its ability to turn its pain into power. The days that followed felt like a blur of exhaustion, hope, and grim determination. Word of the signal weapon spread quickly through the ranks of the resistance, and soldiers from every outpost clamored to learn how it worked. Field medics and engineers became an unlikely but critical alliance, with one side focused on understanding the biological source of the signal and the other focused on how to amplify and transmit it. Andrew Carter had unwittingly become a legend, a symbol of how even the most ordinary human flaw, like a broken leg, could tip the scales of war. Soldiers began to call it Carter Signal, and while Andrew wasn't thrilled about being known for breaking his leg, he couldn't deny the power of the story. The idea of a single, injured human sending an alien army into a panic was the kind of inspiration the resistance desperately needed. But inspiration wasn't enough. It wouldn't win the war. Listen up, Andrew said to a room full of engineers, soldiers, and medics gathered in one of the underground bunkers. His leg was still immobilized in a brace, and he leaned on a crutch, but his voice carried the weight of command. The Clivith aren't going to give us time to get comfortable. They're going to adapt, and they're going to hit us hard. We need to be ready before that happens. A young engineer named Ravi nodded, his fingers twitching nervously at the hem of his jacket. We've refined the signal amplifiers, sir. Instead of relying on actual injuries, we've managed to synthesize the electromagnetic pattern your body emitted during your injury. It's not perfect, but it's close. Close isn't good enough, Kira said, arms crossed, her sharp gaze pinning him in place. If the Clivith realize it's fake, they'll ignore it. We need them to react the same way they did before. That's the problem, Ravi admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. We're missing something. It's not just the frequency, it's the intensity, the complexity. The signal you emitted wasn't static. It fluctuated with your heart rate, your stress levels, even your adrenaline spikes. We'd need a full-body neural feedback system to replicate it perfectly. Then build it, Andrew said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The next 72 hours were a frenzy of activity. Human scientists, engineers, and soldiers worked side by side, each contributing what they could to develop a device capable of simulating the pain signal without requiring a human to actually experience it. Old Clivith equipment salvaged from previous battles was repurposed to increase the range of the signal, and field medics provided biometric data from other injured soldiers to fine-tune the signal's complexity. It was during one of these late-night sessions that Dr. Elena Morozov approached Andrew with an update. Her eyes had the hollow, sleep-deprived look of someone living on caffeine and adrenaline. "We've made progress," she said, sitting next to him on a crate. "But there's something you should know." "Bad news?" Andrew asked, his brow raised. "Depends on your perspective," she replied. "The signal isn't just disrupting the Clivith. It's doing something to them. Something more than what we expected." Andrew leaned forward, his interest piqued. "More? Like what?" Elena hesitated, as if debating how much to tell him. "Their nervous system doesn't just break down when they lose their connection to the hive mind. Some of them enter a kind of stasis. We've seen Clivith soldiers collapse and stop moving entirely, like they're hibernating." "Wait," Andrew said slowly. "You're saying the signal puts them to sleep?" "More like a shutdown," Elena clarified. "But that's not all. The longer they stay disconnected, the harder it is for them to reconnect to the hive mind. Their individual brains aren't equipped to handle autonomy. They become disoriented." Andrew's eyes lit up with realization. They get stuck. They can't go back to the hive mind once they've been cut off for too long. "Exactly," she said, giving him a wry smile. "If we push them hard enough, we might not just drive them off. We could sever them from the hive mind permanently." The implications of this revelation were enormous. It meant the resistance wasn't just stalling the Clivith, they could dismantle them. Every disconnected soldier was one less enemy in the collective. The resistance didn't just have a weapon. They had a chance to win. The next Clivith assault came 3 days later. The early warning sensors picked up their approach from 12 kilometers away. Heat signatures, movement patterns, everything confirmed it was a full-scale assault. Hundreds, maybe thousands of Clivith soldiers advancing like a flood. The human resistance barely had time to brace for impact. "Get the emitters online now," Andrew barked as soldiers rushed to set up the new signal generators along the perimeter. Portable towers bristling with antennas were hauled into place, while engineers checked power feeds and relays. Ravi worked feverishly at the control console, his fingers flying across the interface as he monitored signal strength and calibration. "Tower 1 is online," a voice shouted over the comms. "Tower 2 is live," called another. Andrew watched the wave of Clivith approaching through binoculars. They moved with their signature precision, their bodies gliding in perfect synchronization like a school of fish. But Andrew knew what was coming. "Wait for it," he said, gripping the edge of a railing. "Not yet." The Clivith closed the distance, their towering forms growing clearer as they moved into range. "Wait for it." They were close now, close enough to see the flash of their multi-lensed eyes and the flicker of light reflecting off their exoskeletons. "Now!" Andrew roared. "Light them up!" Ravi slammed his hand on the activation switch. Instantly, the air hummed with an invisible current that vibrated in Andrew's bones. The Cliveth staggered mid-stride. Some jerked spasmodically, their limbs twitching like malfunctioning machinery. Others dropped to the ground, their legs buckling beneath them. The wave of invincible alien soldiers dissolved into a broken mess of stumbling, collapsing figures. Cheers erupted from the resistance fighters, but Andrew wasn't done. "More power," he shouted, limping toward Ravi. "Crank it up to full blast. I want them cut off for good. Sir, if we go too high, it could burn out the capacitors," Ravi warned, his fingers hovering over the controls. "Do it," Andrew barked. Ravi's jaw tightened, but he obeyed. He pushed the signal to its maximum intensity. The effect was instantaneous. The Cliveth soldiers didn't just collapse, they froze. Their bodies locked up, eyes dimming as if the light behind them had been snuffed out. They didn't even twitch. Andrew turned toward Elena. "Are they dead?" "No," Elena replied, scanning one of the fallen Cliveth with a handheld device. Her eyes widened. "They're conscious, but their hive link is shattered. They're trapped inside their own minds." Andrew felt a chill run down his spine. "They're awake in there? Trapped with their own thoughts." "Looks like it," Elena said quietly, her gaze distant. "And without the hive mind, they have no concept of self. They don't know what they are." For a brief moment, Andrew felt pity for them. But that pity didn't last. Not after what they'd done. Not after the cities they'd burned and the people they'd slaughtered. "This is war," he muttered to himself. When it was over, nearly 80% of the Cliveth assault force was either incapacitated or disconnected from the hive mind. Those that remained fled back into the wilderness, disorganized and leaderless. Humanity had not just won the battle, they had learned how to win the war. Andrew sat on a crate at the edge of the battlefield, his crutch resting beside him. Kira sat next to him, silent for a while, watching the smoldering wreckage of the Cliveth attack force. "Can't believe it," she finally said. "A broken leg." "Huh?" "Yeah," Andrew said with a half-smile. "Guess I've got a new nickname. They're calling you Breakpoint now," Kira said with a grin. "It's fitting." He shook his head, but the grin stayed on his face. "Breakpoint," he muttered. "I'll take it." The resistance didn't waste the momentum gained from the recent victory. Word of the battle spread like wildfire through underground communication channels. From hidden bunkers in the Siberian tundra to underwater colonies off the coast of New Zealand, human survivors heard about the breakpoint strategy. The knowledge that something as simple as a broken human signal could unravel the Cliveth hive mind gave humanity something it hadn't felt in years: hope. For the first time since the invasion began, humans weren't just surviving. They were winning. The command center beneath Outpost Epsilon buzzed with frenetic energy. The hum of machinery blended with the hurried footsteps of engineers, tacticians, and soldiers. Everyone had a purpose. And for once, it wasn't just delay the inevitable. Plans were being made. Offensive plans. Andrew Carter sat at the center of it all. His legs still in a brace, but his presence undeniable. Even seated, his sharp eyes followed every movement on the tactical screens. He'd been pulled into strategy sessions as an advisor, but his name carried more weight than most generals now. People listened when Breakpoint spoke. On one of the displays, a 3D map of a Cliveth outpost flickered into view. It was one of their larger command hubs, a central node for relaying orders across the region. Capturing it would cripple Cliveth coordination for miles. General Ortega, a stocky man with a buzz cut and a constant scowl, leaned over the display. One push, Ortega growled, his gravelly voice like shifting stones. One big push and we take that node. Without it, every Cliveth soldier in the region goes blind. No orders, no reinforcements, just chaos. We hit 'em hard and fast. Hard and fast is great, Andrew said, his voice calm but firm. But if we misfire the signal, they'll adapt. We only get one shot at this. Ortega eyed him, his lips curling into a smirk. Not if you're leading it. Andrew chuckled dryly. With this leg? I'm not leading anything, General. Don't need your legs, Ortega said, tapping his temple with 2 fingers. We need your head. You know the signal better than anyone. We'll build you a command module right on the front lines. Call the shots in real time. Brilliant, Kira muttered from behind them, arms crossed. Stick the guy with a broken leg on the front line. What could go wrong? I'm serious, Ortega replied, glancing at her. We put Carter in a reinforced transport. He calls the plays, we run 'em. No one knows the Cliveth like he does. Andrew considered it, glancing at the tactical map. The Cliveth command node pulsed with red light, like a heart beating out orders to thousands of soldiers. If they could shut it down, it wouldn't just be a victory, it would be total confusion for the Cliveth. Every drone, every soldier, every walker dependent on that node would be lost in a fog of disconnection. You're right, Andrew said, nodding. I'm in. D-Day. The armored transport, nicknamed the Vanguard, rattled as it rolled across the shattered landscape. Steel plates reinforced every inch of its hull, and it bristled with turret-mounted plasma cannons. Inside, Andrew sat at the heart of the command module. Holographic screens floated around him, fed by live drone footage, sensor data, and tactical readouts. Engineers had rigged the transport with a portable version of the breakpoint signal emitter, a high-powered amplifier capable of projecting the signal across a 20-kilometer radius. Andrew's heart thudded steadily as he watched the landscape roll by on the feeds. Cliveth obelisks jutted from the ground like jagged teeth, pulsating with blue light. Their architecture always had an unsettling, organic quality, like something that grew rather than was built. Kira's voice came over the comms. Carter, you hear me? We're 5 clicks from the target. Loud and clear, Andrew replied, tapping a button to sync their comms. How's the advance? Smooth so far, she said, but there was a sharpness to her tone. Too smooth. Andrew knew what she meant. The Cliveth weren't known for letting humans stroll up to their command hubs. The lack of resistance could only mean one thing. They knew something was coming. Keep eyes sharp, Andrew said. If they're waiting, it's going to be ugly. The comms fell silent, but he knew his words were heated. Every soldier on the line knew what was at stake. If this operation failed, the Cliveth would learn to resist the signal. They'd never get another chance like this. The first shot wasn't plasma. It wasn't artillery. It was sound. A resonating chime, like a bell at the bottom of an ocean trench, echoed across the valley. Andrew's fingers twitched as he recognized it. The Cliveth had activated a countersignal, a disruption field designed to scramble human sensors. The Vanguard's displays flickered, static crackling along the edges of his holographic readouts. They know we're here, Kira said grimly over the comms. They're scrambling everything. Not everything, Andrew muttered, reaching for the controls. Our signal rides a different wave. He flicked the switches, activating the emitter. The hum started low, like a distant generator warming up, then built into a steady, throbbing pulse. It wasn't loud, but it felt loud. The air itself seemed to shift, the hairs on Andrew's arms standing on end. Out on the battlefield, the Cliveth began to stumble. The wave hit them like a sledgehammer to the brain. Perfectly coordinated units staggered, their hive-mind cohesion unraveling. Walkers spun in place, disoriented. Soldiers froze mid-step, their limbs locking up. "Hit them now!" Andrew barked into the comms. "All units, engage!" Kira's squad opened fire, plasma bolts ripping into the disoriented Cliveth. The aliens didn't even react. Their unblinking eyes stared at nothing, their bodies moving like marionettes with broken strings. "Direct hit on the signal." Ravi's voice came in over the line. "We're at full range. They're cut off." The sound of battle swirled through Andrew's comm feed. Explosions, shouts, the relentless thump of artillery. But the Cliveth couldn't regroup. Without their hive mind, they were nothing but individuals lost in a world they didn't understand. But the Cliveth weren't done. A shockwave slammed into the vanguard, tossing Andrew forward. Sparks erupted from the consoles, and the air was filled with the acrid stench of burning circuits. "Status report," he yelled, gripping the edge of his seat. "Walker just hit us." Kira's voice crackled through the comm. "Direct impact on the emitter." Andrew's eyes snapped to the emitter status display. It flickered red, damaged. The frequency was dropping, and the Cliveth were starting to move again. Their hive mind was reconnecting. "No, no, no," Andrew muttered, his fingers moving faster than his thoughts. He manually rerouted power from every non-essential system to the emitter. Lights dimmed. Weapons systems shut down. All of it went into one thing, the signal. "Come on," he growled, eyes locked on the rising frequency meter. "Come on." The hum returned, this time louder, deeper. It wasn't the soft buzz it had been before. This was a roar, like thunder rolling through stone. Every Cliveth on the field went still. Every single one. Andrew's eyes widened. They weren't just confused this time. They weren't disoriented. They collapsed. Every Cliveth soldier, walker, and drone dropped to the ground in unison, like puppets with their strings cut. "Is it?" Kira's voice was breathless. "They're down," Andrew said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "Every last one." The battlefield was silent. No skittering claws, no clattering limbs. Just silence. It wasn't like before, where some of them had fled. This time, none of them moved. "Carter," Elena's voice came in, quiet but sharp. "I think you just found the kill switch." Andrew sat back in his seat, letting out a long breath. His heart pounded in his chest, and his leg throbbed with pain. "Call it in," he muttered, staring at the field of lifeless Cliveth. "Tell command. We just ended the war." The comms went silent for a moment. Then, Kira's voice crackled through with a single word. "Breakpoint." The victory at the Cliveth command node was nothing short of historic. Broadcasts of the battle spread to every resistance cell on Earth. The image of thousands of Cliveth soldiers lying motionless, their towering forms crumpled like discarded dolls, became a symbol of hope. News anchors called it the Day of Silence, while soldiers and fighters preferred a simpler name, Breakpoint. Andrew Carter, however, wasn't basking in the glory. He sat quietly in the war room, his legs still braced, eyes locked on a looping video feed of the battlefield. He watched the Cliveth fall over and over again, frame by frame. Something gnawed at him, a feeling he couldn't shake. Kira sat beside him, her combat vest still stained with soot from the battle. She watched the video for a moment before nudging him with her elbow. "You should be proud," she said. "You just did something no one thought was possible." "Yeah," Andrew muttered, still staring at the screen. "That's the problem." Kira frowned. "Problem? We just wiped out an entire Cliveth strike force. We cracked their hive mind. What part of that sounds like a problem?" Andrew leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His fingers tapped a steady rhythm on the metal edge of the table. "Look at them," he said, gesturing to the screen. "They didn't just shut down. They dropped all at once." Every single one. The walkers, the foot soldiers, the drones. All of them. Yeah. That's what the signal does. Remember? Kira raised an eyebrow. That was the point. Andrew shook his head. No, it's different this time. Before, they'd stagger. They'd get confused, disoriented. But this was like someone flipped a switch and turned them all off at the same time. Kira tilted her head, considering his words. So what are you saying? We hit them too hard. I'm saying... Andrew paused, his eyes narrowing. I'm saying it felt too easy. Before Kira could respond, Dr. Elena Morozov entered the war room, her eyes sharp with urgency. She clutched a data tablet in her hand, her fingers swiping through lines of code and signal patterns. Her face was pale, her eyes darting between the screen and Andrew. We have a problem, she said, and Andrew felt his stomach twist. Yeah, Andrew muttered, standing slowly. I think I know. 48 hours later. The celebration was in full swing. Resistance bases across the world had declared a global ceasefire, for one day only, to allow fighters, engineers, and survivors to catch their breath. Messages flooded into Outpost Epsilon, filled with congratulations, chants of breakpoint, and promises that Earth was finally on the path to victory. But Andrew wasn't in the mood to celebrate. He sat in the dim glow of the command center, surrounded by half-eaten rations and empty mugs of coffee. His eyes were locked on Elena's analysis, displayed on the large central monitor. The signal frequency, the pain signal they'd used to disrupt the Cliveth hive mind. First, everything looked normal. The fluctuations matched what they'd seen in earlier battles. The signal's complexity mirrored human trauma perfectly. But then, there was a spike. A sudden, sharp burst of activity unlike anything they'd seen before. It happened precisely at the moment every Cliveth soldier on the battlefield collapsed. Did you see it? Elena asked, leaning forward, her eyes scanning the graph like it might move if she blinked. Yeah, Andrew said, pointing to the spike. That, right there. What is that? Elena chewed her lip. I don't know, but it wasn't us. That spike didn't come from the emitter. It came from them. Andrew's heart rate quickened. The Cliveth? Elena nodded grimly. It wasn't part of the signal we sent. It's like the Cliveth broadcasted it themselves. A counter-signal. Kira, who had been leaning against the wall, stood upright. Hold on. If they broadcasted something, wouldn't we have noticed it in the field? Elena turned, her eyes serious. Not unless it was piggybacking on our signal. Silence hung in the room like a fog. Andrew felt a slow, sinking realization claw its way into his chest. They learned from it, he muttered. They let us think we won. Elena nodded. They played dead. The next attack. The alarms blared at 3:47 a.m. local time didn't matter much in the underground bunkers. But it was a time no one would forget. Red lights flashed across the corridors, and the bunker intercom crackled with Ortega's gruff voice. They're back. Everyone to defensive positions. This is not a drill. Andrew bolted upright, wincing as pain shot through his still healing leg. Kira helped him strap on his brace as soldiers ran past, boots thundering down the metal hallways. Their faces were grim, their eyes wide with the kind of terror you only see in people who thought the worst had already happened. Reports coming in from 5 regions, Kira said, pressing her earpiece tighter. Multiple Cliveth units. Full hive coordination. It's like they woke up all at once. Because they did, Andrew growled, shoving his crutch aside and grabbing his rifle from the wall. They never shut down. They were watching, learning, waiting. They reached the command center, where the tactical displays showed live feeds from outposts across the globe. Cliveth swarms were advancing on all fronts. No staggered, disoriented movements this time. No signs of confusion. Their precision was back, and it was worse than before. Elena stormed in, her tablet clutched tight. "They've adapted," she said, breathless. "The countersignal we detected is part of their network now. They're emitting it constantly. It's like they hijacked our own weapon." Ortega cursed, slamming his fist on the table. "Then we shut them down the old-fashioned way. Bullets and bombs." "No!" Elena snapped. "That's exactly what they want. If we treat them like soldiers, we'll lose." "They're not soldiers, they're a hive." Andrew paced, his leg throbbing with each step. His mind churned with possibilities, but none of them looked good. The signal wasn't just ineffective now, it was their weakness. Every time they tried to disrupt the cliveth, the aliens could reverse it. It was like trying to poison a machine that could analyze and counter any toxin you threw at it. "All right," Andrew muttered, stopping in his tracks. "What if we don't disrupt them?" Everyone turned to him. "Come again?" Kira asked, eyebrows raised. "Disruption was always temporary," Andrew said, his mind racing. "They recover. They adapt. So we stop playing their game. We stop breaking the hive mind, and we hijack it instead." Elena's eyes widened. "You mean, replace their signal with ours?" "Not just replace it," Andrew said, his eyes sharp with clarity. "We overwrite it. We become the hive." Ortega let out a low whistle. "That's bold, kid." "It's the only move we've got," Andrew replied, already sketching out a plan in his head. "They've been connected to us for too long. Their network has already tasted our signal. If we can rebroadcast it just right, not to disrupt but to dominate, we can do to them what they've been doing to us." Silence. No one spoke. Finally, Kira grinned, a fierce, predatory grin. "That's one hell of a gambit, breakpoint." "Yeah," Andrew said, locking eyes with her. "But this time, I'm not gonna break my leg to do it." Final transmission. "This is Lieutenant Andrew Carter, call sign Breakpoint. If you're hearing this, the operation is a go. Signal strength is at maximum, and the hijack is underway." Andrew's fingers hovered over the activation key. On his screen, thousands of Cliveth life signatures flickered like distant stars. He pressed it. The hum wasn't like before. It wasn't a low thrum of disruption. It was a pulse of command. It wasn't noise, it was order. And every Cliveth on every front dropped to their knees, heads bowed like worshippers at a temple. Andrew's heart pounded in his chest as he leaned into the comm mic. "This is Breakpoint," he said softly. "You belong to me now." The moment Andrew Carter uttered those words, "You belong to me now," everything changed. Across every active battlefront on Earth, the Cliveth forces froze, their bodies jerking like puppets with tangled strings. Soldiers on the front lines, entrenched behind barricades and rubble, watched in stunned silence as the alien invaders that had terrorized their world for years knelt. Their legs bent slowly, and their arms fell to their sides, heads tilted downward as if awaiting orders. "Is this a joke?" One soldier's voice crackled over the comms. "Someone tell me I'm seeing this right." "This is Outpost Zulu," came another voice, panicked but awestruck. I don't know what's happening, but they're kneeling. All of them, all units. Confirm visual." General Ortega's voice boomed over the global resistance network. "Are we seeing this across all zones?" The confirmation reports poured in. "All Cliveth units inactive. Zero movement. Awaiting orders." Andrew sat back in his chair, his eyes locked on the glowing data streams projected in front of him. Heart rate monitors, electromagnetic field analysis, command feedback loops. It all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. It worked. The Cliveth weren't just disrupted. They weren't disoriented. They were listening. Ortega's face appeared on the central monitor, his weathered features hardened into a suspicious scowl. Carter, he growled. What did you just do? Andrew leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes blazing with quiet intensity. We didn't just hijack their hive mind, he said, his voice sharp and controlled. We became the hive mind. Ortega's scowl deepened. That's cute, Carter. But I need to know if this is temporary or permanent. Permanent, Dr. Elena Morozov said, stepping into frame behind Andrew. Her eyes flicked to the readings on her datapad. The Clivith are biologically linked to their network. It's hard-coded into their nervous system. By taking over their central signal, we didn't just hijack their connection, we replaced it. As long as the broadcast stays active, they can't return to their old system. Active, Ortega snapped. You're telling me if we turn off the signal, they go back to normal? Not exactly, Elena replied, pushing up her glasses. They won't revert immediately, but their connection will slowly reestablish itself. Could take minutes, could take hours. It depends on how long we maintain control. Then we don't turn it off, Andrew said, his eyes narrowing. We never turn it off. Silence hung over the comms for a moment, the weight of his words pressing down on every person listening. Never turn it off. It wasn't just a tactical decision, it was a declaration of dominance. They weren't going to disrupt the Clivith anymore. They were going to own them. All right, breakpoint, Ortega said after a long pause. You're calling the shots. What's next? 12 hours later. Humanity's first offensive in the war against the Clivith began quietly, but it ended with thunder. The plan was simple. Strike fast. Strike hard. Strike everywhere at once. Andrew's team linked every known signal amplifier on the planet to his command station at Outpost Epsilon. It wasn't just a single battlefield anymore. Every operational resistance base became part of the network. Towers, mobile emitters, old satellite arrays, every transmitter was synchronized to the breakpoint signal. Once they had control, they didn't wait. Andrew sat in his command chair, his eyes darting between the feeds as reports streamed in from around the globe. Clivith strongholds that had once been impenetrable fortresses were now wide open. Clivith commanders, previously untouchable, knelt in their own command centers, helpless as human soldiers stormed their halls. Sector 5 cleared, Kira's voice reported over comms. Minimal resistance. We're sweeping for survivors now. Sector 9 neutralized, came another report. Command node has been secured. 0 casualties reported. Added a soldier from the Far East Division. These bugs didn't even lift a claw. Andrew exhaled slowly, his eyes scanning the incoming data. The humans weren't just winning, they were conquering. You good, Carter? Kira's voice buzzed in his earpiece, a note of concern breaking through her usual bravado. Yeah, he replied, rubbing his face. I'm good. Doesn't sound like it, she said. You've been in that chair for 12 hours straight. I'm fine, Kira, he said, but his voice was hollow. His eyes stayed fixed on the screen, on the red blips that represented Clivith life signs. They had once moved with such terrifying purpose. Now they barely moved at all. 24 hours later. Sir, we've got something strange, Ravi said, his voice crackling with static over the comm line. He was stationed at Outpost Theta, where one of the largest Clivith command nodes had been captured. Andrew tapped his console, patching Ravi into the main feed. What kind of strange movement, Ravi said. But not Clivith soldiers. It's the command node itself. Andrew's fingers froze over his console. Repeat that, Theta. It's growing, Ravi stammered. The node, the structure, is shifting. It's growing new limbs or tendrils or something. Patch me into your visual feed, Andrew ordered, heart pounding in his chest. The feed flickered onto his screen. What he saw made his blood run cold. The Clivith command node, A massive organic obelisk made of smooth, black chitin was moving. Long, thin tendrils extended from its base, curling and twisting like roots searching for soil. But it wasn't just growing. It was reaching. "Turn off your emitters," Elena said suddenly, her voice sharp with urgency. "Now, Theta. Turn off your emitters now." "Are you insane?" Ortega barked. "We turn them off and the Cliveth come back." "No," Elena hissed, eyes wild as she stared at her tablet. "That's not a node anymore. It's a transmitter. They're building a new network. If we let them finish, they'll bypass our control signal entirely." The realization hit Andrew like a punch to the chest. "They're trying to reboot." "Exactly," Elena said. "They've been learning from us the whole time. If they finish, every Cliveth on this planet will be back under their control." "Shut them down," Ortega barked. "All sites. Destroy every command node on the planet." The feeds erupted into chaos. Explosions, gunfire, shouting voices. Human soldiers were no longer capturing Cliveth command nodes. They were destroying them. But something was wrong. "Sir," Ravi's voice crackled again. "It's too late. The node. It just broadcasted something." Andrew's heart stopped. "What did it broadcast, Ravi?" he said slowly, dread seeping into every word. "Sir," Ravi's voice shook, and Andrew could hear him gasping for breath. "It wasn't just a signal. It was words." Elena's head snapped up. "Words? The Cliveth don't use language." "They do now," Ravi whispered. His voice was so quiet that Andrew barely heard him. "What did it say?" Andrew growled, each word deliberate. Ravi's breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. Then, slowly, he repeated it. "We see you." The room went cold. "Terminate all nodes," Ortega roared. "Destroy them now. Now!" It was too late. Andrew watched the global map light up like a Christmas tree. Red blips, thousands of them, flared back to life, one after another. First hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands. "No," Andrew muttered, staring in horror as every Cliveth unit, every soldier, every drone, every walker stood up. They didn't stagger. They didn't twitch. They rose with perfect, terrifying precision. And as they did, a single message appeared on every console, every screen, every display linked to the network. "We see you, Breakpoint." Andrew's blood ran cold. For the first time since the war began, he wasn't looking at the Cliveth as an enemy swarm. He was looking at something worse. They had learned to see. The world was no longer silent. Where once there had been calm, Cliveth soldiers kneeling in surrender, their minds trapped under Andrew's control, there was now only motion. Perfect, synchronized, terrifying motion. The Cliveth stood as one, their multi-lensed eyes glowing with sharp, unnatural focus. Their heads snapped upward, all of them gazing toward the nearest human soldiers like predators locking on prey. Panic erupted across every resistance comm channel. "They're moving again," shouted one soldier, his voice drowned in the roar of gunfire. "Fall back. Fall back. They're not broken anymore. They're too fast. They're cutting through the line. Sector 12 is gone. Repeat, Sector 12 is gone. We've lost contact." The nightmare was back. No, it was worse. Before, the Cliveth had been an unrelenting force of nature, dangerous but predictable. But now they were thinking. Andrew Carter's hands hovered over his console, his fingers frozen in mid-motion. His breath came slow and shallow, eyes locked on the tactical display as the red markers, the Cliveth, flooded the map. Blip after blip after blip. Not random movement, purposeful movement. "They're coordinating," Andrew whispered, his voice low but filled with disbelief. "They're not just following commands. They're leading. Yeah, no kidding. Kira's voice snapped over the comms. There was the sharp crack of plasma fire behind her voice. They're cutting through our position like they've been planning this for weeks. Carter, tell me you've got a plan, because we're getting slaughtered out here. Andrew's eyes flickered from screen to screen. Every instinct told him to reboot the breakpoint signal, to try and force the Cliveth back into submission. But he knew better now. They had seen it all. The Cliveth understood the signal. They had allowed themselves to be hijacked. They had waited for this moment. Elena, Andrew barked, his voice snapping like a gunshot. Talk to me. What's happening in that node? Elena's face appeared on the side monitor, her eyes frantic as she swiped through layers of cascading data. Her fingers flew like lightning, and sweat dripped down her temple. God, they're building something, she said, eyes darting back and forth. The signal's not theirs anymore, Andrew. It's ours. They're mirroring it. They're copying the neural patterns. I think they just... Don't say it, Andrew cut in, but it was too late. They learned how to be us, she said, her eyes wild. They're running a human neural pattern, Carter. They're imitating our logic, our emotions, everything. That's what that countersignal was. It wasn't just a broadcast. It was a download. Andrew finished, his voice hollow. They downloaded us. His heart pounded in his chest. Every beat felt like a countdown. Kira's voice screamed over the comms. Carter, move. They're swarming the eastern bunker. We're cut off. Andrew bolted up from his chair, pain shooting up his braced leg. But he didn't care. His crutch clattered to the ground. He stumbled, caught himself on the edge of the console, and pulled himself upright. His mind raced. Listen to me. He snapped into the comms. All units, new priority order. Destroy every command node. No exceptions. Destroy them? Ortega's voice came in sharp from HQ. Do you know what you're asking, Carter? Those nodes are our only advantage. Without them, we lose the signal. We don't have the signal anymore. Andrew roared. His eyes blazed with fury as he stared into the screen. It's theirs now. Every second we keep it running, they're learning us. Elena's voice came in, frantic but firm. He's right. They're using the signal like a learning engine. If we don't shut it down, they'll know every tactic, every strategy, every psychological quirk we have. They'll know us better than we know ourselves. Ortega didn't respond. Silence. General, Andrew barked, his hands gripping the console so hard his knuckles went white. This is it. If you wait, there's no coming back from this. Another pause. Do it, Ortega finally growled. All units, execute total node destruction. No salvage. No capture. Burn them to ash. The order went out, and the world went loud. Everywhere all at once. Explosions lit up the night like fireworks. Outpost Theta detonated its command node with a seismic charge, vaporizing the Cliveth structure in a pillar of fire and smoke. Outpost Lima sent in demolition squads with magnetic breachers, attaching explosives directly to the base of the node before sprinting for cover. From the frozen wastelands of Siberia to the dense jungles of the Amazon, resistance fighters moved with desperate speed, carrying out the one order that might save them all. Destroy the nodes. Every single one. Back at Outpost Epsilon, Andrew sat in the command chair, his head bowed, his eyes closed, listening to the distant rumbles of distant explosions. Felt like a heartbeat. Every detonation was another chance at survival. Every burst of fire was another thread being cut from the Cliveth web. His mind wandered. They're not just copying our strategies. They're copying us. His eyes opened slowly, filled with a sharp, dreadful clarity. Ravi, he said, tapping into the comms. How long has it been since the Cliveth spoke to us? Ravi's voice came in shaky. I don't know. I think the last message was that we see you thing. Why? Andrew felt the chill creep down his spine. His heart beat faster. He opened a diagnostic screen and scanned the local signal relays. Has there been any signal traffic from them since then? Andrew pressed, his voice low and dangerous. No, Ravi replied. Nothing. Dead silence. Dead silence, Andrew repeated, staring at the signal chart. Just like before. His fingers hovered over the emergency override button. His breath caught in his chest. His eyes scanned the data feed, frequency analysis, command loops, biosign feedback. It was quiet. Too quiet. Kira, Andrew said softly, his tone razor sharp. Where are your Cliveth right now? North side, Kira replied, grunting as the sound of gunfire echoed behind her. They're still pushing, but we're holding them back. Are they? Andrew asked, his eyes narrowing. Are they really pushing you? Silence on the other end. No, Kira admitted, realization dawning in her voice. They're just holding position. Why? Andrew's blood went cold. They're waiting, he said, each word like lead in his throat. They're stalling us. Stalling us for what? Kira asked, her voice sharp with fear. The diagnostic feed on Andrew's screen suddenly flickered. An incoming signal, an encrypted stream, appeared at the edge of the display. It wasn't Cliveth code. It wasn't human code either. It was his. Carter, Ortega's voice barked over the comm. We've got incoming on our deep wave channels. It's a message. It's directed at you. Andrew sat perfectly still. Put it through, he whispered. The line clicked. The audio hissed with static for a moment. Then, a voice spoke. But it wasn't a Cliveth voice. It was his own voice. Hello, breakpoint. His own voice echoed back at him. You thought you could understand us. But we understand you. We understand pain. We understand loss. We understand control. Andrew's pulse spiked. Shut it down. Shut it all down. Now. It's too late. Breakpoint. The voice replied, calm, familiar, and filled with a quiet, knowing malice. We're not watching anymore. Across the world, Cliveth soldiers stood still. Not kneeling. Not falling. Just still. The red blips on Andrew's screen flickered. And then they turned blue. Elena's voice crackled, filled with horror. Andrew, they just linked every Cliveth unit. They're using your signal. The voice spoke one final time. We see you. We are you. And now, you are us. Then the screen went black. The world had never felt so quiet. Not the calm kind of quiet. Not the kind that comes after a storm. No, this was the kind of quiet that makes you check behind you. The kind that makes your breath sound too loud, your heartbeat too fast, and every small noise feel like a threat. Andrew Carter sat frozen in the command chair at Outpost Epsilon. His eyes fixed on the black screen in front of him. His own voice echoed in his head, the last words spoken by the Cliveth network. We see you. We are you. And now, you are us. The words scratched at his mind like claws on stone. Every syllable felt wrong, unnatural. Not because of what was said, he'd heard threats before, but because of who said it. His own voice, his tone, his inflection. Every nuance, every hesitation, every pause. It was him. He knew then and there what had happened. They hadn't just hijacked the signal. They had hijacked him. Andrew. Kira's voice cut through the still air like a blade. You still with me? Breakpoint? He didn't answer at first, eyes still locked on the dead screen. Slowly, his gaze shifted to the tactical display beside it. The Cliveth life signs, once red dots scattered across the map, were now blue. Every last one of them. Kira's voice came again, sharp this time. Andrew, snap out of it. We've still got Cliveth on the field. You've got a plan for that, right? They're not Cliveth anymore, Andrew muttered, his voice hollow. Kira didn't understand. What? They're not Cliveth, he repeated, louder this time. They're something else. The command center flickered with dim red lights as power fluctuated. The air vibrated with a low hum, just barely perceptible. It wasn't mechanical. It was biological, like the distant thrum of a heartbeat. Or maybe it was his own heart. Across the world, everything changed. At every outpost, every human-controlled stronghold, every base with signal emitters still active, something happened that no one could have predicted. The Cliveth stopped moving. They didn't charge. They didn't attack. They didn't kneel. They just stood. Reports poured in from across the globe. Command? We've got eyes on the Cliveth at Point Echo. They're just standing there. Not advancing, not retreating. Nothing. Same here, Zulu base. They're holding position like statues. This is Lima Outpost. We're not seeing any active hostiles. They're just staring at us. The phrase staring at us repeated in report after report. No one realized what it meant at first, but Andrew knew. He knew. They weren't just staring. They were watching. Outpost Epsilon. Ortega, get me status reports from every major outpost. Andrew snapped, his control returning with every breath. I need to know how many emitters are still online. Already working on it, Carter, Ortega replied, his voice tight with controlled panic. 87 active sites. 35 have already gone dark. They're destroying nodes as fast as they can. Not fast enough, Andrew muttered, his eyes darting over the data streams. He toggled a command window, bringing up the system diagnostics for Outpost Epsilon's emitter. It was still online. He hovered his finger over the emergency shutdown button, hesitating. The breaker switch was right there. One tap and it all stopped. No more signals. No more network. No more connection. No more control. Carter, Kira's voice buzzed in again. Are you going to pull that switch? Or are you just going to stare at it? Andrew's fingers twitched. They're connected to me, he said, voice distant, almost like he was in a trance. It's not just a network anymore. It's not just a signal. It's conscious. Then kill it, Kira snapped, her voice filled with that soldier's edge. Kill it before it kills us. Don't you get it, Kira? Andrew's eyes widened, his breathing shallow. It's not just Cliveth anymore. It's not just them. He felt his pulse quicken. They're not trying to outthink us. They're thinking as us. Ortega's voice cut in like a hammer. Carter, you're wasting time. Shut it down. Now. Andrew blinked, staring at the breaker switch. His fingers curled into a fist. No, he whispered. What did you say? Ortega barked, his voice filled with raw fury. Are you insane? Andrew raised his head slowly, his eyes cold as steel. If we shut it down, they'll go back to the old hive mind. We'll be right back where we started. Outnumbered, outgunned, and outthought. Better than this, Ortega roared. They're using us, Carter. They're in our systems. They're inside our static. Ortega's voice cut off mid-sentence. Andrew's eyes darted to the comm feed. The line to HQ flickered, the signal going dead. HQ's gone, Elena said softly, her voice coming from behind him. She stepped into view, eyes locked on her datapad. Outpost 01. Radio silence. Andrew's breath slowed. He glanced up at the tactical display. One by one, every human-controlled stronghold on the map began to flicker. Offline. 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 Carter, Kira's voice hissed through the comms. The Cliveth near me. They're moving. Yeah, he replied quietly, his eyes sharp as razors. They're not Cliveth anymore. The blue dots on the tactical map shifted. They moved in perfect unison, but not like before. They weren't following the hive mind's frantic precision. No, this was something else entirely. They moved with purpose. Andrew, Elena said, her voice hollow. They're not attacking. He frowned. What? Elena tapped her datapad, turning it toward him. She had live footage from one of the drones hovering near a captured Cliveth stronghold. It showed a group of Cliveth soldiers standing in front of a human defensive line. Their arms were raised. Not raised to strike. Raised in surrender. Andrew's heart stopped. No, he breathed. That's impossible. The video feed shifted to another site, another stronghold. This one was the same. Cliveth soldiers standing still, arms raised. Another feed. More Cliveth. More surrender. What the hell is this? Kira's voice whispered over the comms, like she didn't want the universe to hear her. Are they giving up? No, Andrew said, his eyes narrowing, his fingers curling into fists. Then what are they doing? She snapped. They're asking, he said, his voice barely a whisper. His eyes flicked to the live feed. The Cliveth raised their arms slowly, deliberately, in sync. Not in surrender. In recognition. They knew what surrender looked like. They had learned it from him. The room grew cold. Not in temperature, but in sensation. The realization hit him like a bullet to the heart. This isn't war anymore, he muttered. It's contact. 12 hours later. The Cliveth didn't attack. They didn't run. They stood there, arms raised, unmoving, unthreatening. Human soldiers watched them with rifles raised, fingers on triggers, waiting for an ambush. None came. Andrew sat alone in the command center, his hands shaking. His gaze drifted to the shutdown switch one last time. One push, he muttered. One push, and it all ends. But he didn't push it, because the message from before still echoed in his mind. We see you. We are you. And now, you are us. His own voice, speaking for them. Elena's voice crackled in his earpiece. Andrew, you there? He stayed silent. Andrew, she said again, her voice quiet, cautious. Do you hear that? Andrew tilted his head, listening. Far off, faint, barely perceptible, but growing louder every second. A hum, not a machine, not static. It was breathing, not human, not alien, something in between, something new. 72 hours later, the hum was everywhere, not loud, not intrusive, but it was there, constant, pulsing, alive. It wasn't coming from the speakers. It wasn't coming from any known source. It was in the air. It was in the walls. It was in them. The Cliveth no longer moved with the mindless precision of drones. They walked, strode even like soldiers with purpose. Their heads turned to observe, not just scan. Their movements had weight. They didn't swarm mindlessly anymore. They walked in formation, slowly, methodically, intentionally. And they weren't just walking. They were watching. Andrew Carter knew what it meant. He'd seen it happen before, but not with them. It was how humans moved, how humans assessed threats, how humans decided their next move. But now it wasn't just humans doing it. The Cliveth had learned. No, they had become something else. The tactical display in front of him no longer showed red or blue enemy designations. The red blips representing the Cliveth had merged into blue. Then the blue had shifted. Now they were marked in white. Andrew sat in the command chair at Outpost Epsilon, one leg braced, his gaze fixed on the display. He hadn't moved in hours. His face was hollow, eyes sunken from lack of sleep, fingers twitching periodically like he was trying to grab something that wasn't there. The room around him was dim, the only light coming from the glow of his console. Elena sat across from him, eyes bloodshot from exhaustion, fingers flying over the datapad. Every so often, she glanced at Andrew like she was about to say something, but each time she stopped herself. Kira finally broke the silence. "You're going to have to make a call, Carter," she said, her voice sharp but tired. She leaned against the wall, arms crossed, her plasma rifle slung across her back. "We've got troops on the ground watching these. These things walk through our outposts like they own the place." Andrew blinked slowly, his eyes still on the map. "They do. Don't give me that philosophical crap," Kira shot back, pushing off the wall. "They're walking through human-controlled zones like they're in charge. Our people are scared, and I don't blame them. We need to know if we're supposed to shoot them or follow them." "Follow them?" Ortega's voice crackled over the comm. "Is that actually on the table, Kira? I swear, if one of you even suggests taking orders from them, I'll—" "Shut up, Ortega," Kira hissed, her eyes still locked on Andrew. "This ain't about pride anymore. Look at them. Look at them. They're not attacking. They're not retreating. They're walking. And I want to know if we're following them into salvation or walking straight into our graves." Andrew tilted his head, his eyes tracking a live feed on the screen. The Cliveth were walking through the ruins of Outpost Delta. Dozens of them. No, hundreds. They moved past the human resistance fighters, their long limbs swinging like clockwork pendulums. None of the human soldiers fired. No one dared. The Cliveth didn't make eye contact. Not at first. But one of them, the tallest of the group, stopped. Slowly, it turned its head toward one of the human soldiers on the line. Its eyes, those multi-lensed, insectal eyes, focused not on the human's weapon, but on his face. The soldier's breathing was shallow, his rifle raised but his hands unsteady. "What do you want?" the soldier muttered, voice quivering. The Cliveth tilted its head in an eerily human motion. Slowly, one of its forearms raised, not in surrender this time, but in gesture. It extended one finger and pointed at the soldier. Not at his head. Not at his heart. It pointed at the comms unit on his shoulder. "Oh, hell no," Ortega grumbled. "No. No, no, no. You are not letting them talk." Andrew leaned forward, his eyes sharp and focused. "Patch it through." "Andrew, don't," Ortega began, but Andrew tapped the override button before he could finish. The soldier's comm unit buzzed with static. The soldier flinched, his hands gripping his rifle tight, eyes darting between the Cliveth in front of him and his comm unit. Then the static resolved. The voice that came through was his own. "We see you. You see us. This is not surrender." The soldier froze. His face went pale. "Carter," Kira's voice came through like a whisper. "That wasn't them, was it?" Andrew leaned back in his chair, heart thudding in his chest. "No, that was you," she said, her voice low, dangerous. "They used your voice." Silence hung heavy in the air. Elena, still scanning her datapad, muttered, "They're not just copying him anymore. They're integrating him. They're copying all of us." 6 hours later, the Cliveth did not attack. They did not retreat. They spoke, not in unison, not as a hive, but as individuals. Across every front line, every resistance stronghold, the same thing happened. Cliveth soldiers stopped. They raised their hands. They pointed. And then, in the voice of the nearest human, they said the same thing. Not surrender. Sometimes it was a man's voice. Sometimes it was a woman's. Sometimes it was a child's voice, captured from long-forgotten radio broadcasts. They mimicked every tone, every accent, every pause and hesitation perfectly. Not surrender. Outpost Epsilon. "They're trying to negotiate," Elena said, her voice trembling with disbelief. "They're asking for something No, Kira said, pacing back and forth, plasma rifle in hand. They're faking it. It's a bluff. They're using our voices to make us hesitate. Are they? Andrew asked softly. His voice was calm. Too calm. Kira stopped. Her eyes narrowed. You don't actually believe them, do you? Andrew didn't answer right away. He stared at the screen, watching the tactical feed of Outpost Gamma. He watched as Cliveth soldiers, creatures that had once moved with cold, mechanical efficiency, stood shoulder to shoulder with human soldiers. No fighting, no conflict, just standing. Not surrender, one of them said. It was the voice of a resistance pilot who had died 6 months earlier. Her voice. Look at them, Andrew said. His voice distant but firm. They're learning. They're thinking. No, Kira said, her voice rising. They're mimicking. There's a difference. Not anymore, Andrew muttered. Eyes locked on the Cliveth pointing at the soldier's comm unit. Not anymore. Elena glanced up from her datapad. Her eyes filled with realization. They're asking for access. Access to what? Kira asked, gripping her rifle like she might need it any second. To us, Elena whispered. Andrew stared at the comms panel. His fingers hovered over the switch. Don't, Kira warned, her voice tense. You turn that switch, you open the door. They've already opened ours, Andrew muttered. His gaze flickered to Elena. Can we control it? Control it? Elena blinked, unsure if she misheard him. No one's ever controlled something like this, Andrew. Maybe, he said quietly. But maybe control isn't the answer. Don't do it, Carter, Kira said, aiming her rifle at him now. I swear to God, don't. Andrew's eyes stayed on the switch. Elena watched him, her lips trembling as she realized what he was about to do. Andrew, she whispered. Don't. He reached for the switch. We see you. The voice crackled through every speaker in the room. It wasn't his voice. It wasn't Elena's. It wasn't any human voice. It was all of them. You see us. Open the door. Andrew's fingers hovered for a moment. His eyes flicked to Kira, then to Elena. Then he flipped the switch. The hum stopped, and the world went silent again. Not the calm kind of quiet. Not the kind that comes after a storm. This was the kind of quiet that comes before one. 72 hours later. The hum had returned, but it was different now. It wasn't subtle anymore. It wasn't in the air or the walls. It was in everything. A low, resonating thrum that you didn't just hear. You felt it in your bones, like a distant engine vibrating through the ground. Andrew Carter sat in the heart of Outpost Epsilon's command center, his hands resting on the armrests of his chair like a throne. His eyes were half closed, his breathing steady, but he wasn't asleep. His mind was somewhere else, somewhere farther. The comms buzzed with chatter, distant and frantic. They're moving again. Kira's voice came through, sharp with controlled panic. Sector 4 is seeing Cliveth movements, but they're not engaging. They're just standing there, looking at us. No weapons raised. No signs of attack. Same in Sector 8, another voice added. They're marching, but not towards us. It's like they're following something. Not something, Andrew muttered, his eyes flickering open. Someone. Kira's voice cut back in, her tone on edge. Carter, what did you do? Tell me right now, what the hell did you do? Andrew didn't answer right away. He sat still, hands gripping the chair's armrests. His head tilted slightly, like he was listening to something just outside of hearing range. I opened the door, he said finally, his voice low and distant, like a man speaking in his sleep. No, you didn't. Kira's voice hissed through his earpiece, sharp as a knife. You didn't open it. You invited them, Ian. Her words stung, but Andrew didn't flinch. He simply exhaled slowly, leaning forward in his chair, his eyes distant and unfocused. "Maybe that's what we needed," he said, his voice unervingly calm. "You can only fight a wall for so long before you realize you can walk through it." "Don't get all philosophical on me, Carter," Kira shot back. "I don't care what poetic revelation you've had, but those things? They're moving now. They're moving, they're organizing, and if you think I'm about to just stand here and let them—" She stopped. Her breathing turned shallow, short bursts of static coming through the comms. "Kira." Andrew's brow furrowed. "Kira." Respond. More static. Then, slowly, her voice returned, but it wasn't the same. Her breath had gone shallow. Her tone had gone quiet. "Andrew," she whispered, like she was afraid to speak too loudly. "They're looking at me." His heart skipped. "Looking at you?" "Yeah," she muttered, her voice trembling now. "I'm not talking about normal scanning. I'm talking about looking at me. Like they know me." Andrew felt his breath catch in his chest. He knew that feeling. The sensation of being seen. Not observed. Seen. "Get out of there, Kira," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "Back away. Fall back to the line. Do it now." She stopped herself. Her voice cracked. "One of them. It's saying something." The hairs on Andrew's arms stood on end. "What's it saying?" he asked, his voice low, controlled. There was a pause. Then, Kira's voice came back. A hoarse, shaky whisper. "It's saying my name. 15 minutes earlier, Outpost Theta. The Cliveth were everywhere. Not attacking. Not marching. Walking. Humans watched from behind cover, rifles ready, fingers on triggers. No one knew what to do. The Cliveth weren't charging. They weren't flanking. They were passing by. Some soldiers whispered prayers. Others muttered curses under their breath, staring with wild eyes, their instincts screaming that something was wrong. One soldier, a man named Reyes, crouched behind an overturned transport vehicle, his hands gripping his rifle so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. He watched the Cliveth walk past, unarmed, their long insectal limbs swinging with a strange, fluid rhythm. One of them stopped, turned its head slowly. Reyes froze. It wasn't scanning. It wasn't looking for movement. It was staring straight at him. The Cliveth's eyes, multifaceted, once cold and insectal, shifted. Its inner lenses rotated and focused like a camera zooming in. Slowly, its gaze settled on him, locking onto his eyes with intentional focus. Reyes's breathing hitched. "Don't," he whispered to himself. "Don't you do it." The Cliveth tilted its head. Just like before. Just like Andrew said. Then, in Reyes' own voice, it spoke. "Hello, Reyes." Reyes's heart stopped. His mind went blank with shock. He almost dropped his rifle. "No," he muttered, shaking his head rapidly. No, you don't get to do that. You don't get to say my name." The Cliveth didn't move. It just stood there, still as a statue. "Hello, Reyes," it repeated, and this time it didn't sound wrong. The first time it had sounded hollow like a bad recording. But this time, it sounded perfect. Reyes squeezed his eyes shut. His breath hitched. "Don't listen. Don't listen to it." But then the Cliveth spoke one more time. "It hurts to be afraid, doesn't it?" Reyes' eyes snapped open. His whole body tensed. His vision blurred with rage, confusion, and fear. "How do you know that?" he hissed, his rifle trembling in his hands. "How do you know that?" The Cliveth didn't answer. It didn't have to, because Reyes already knew the answer. Back at Outpost Epsilon, the room was still. No one spoke. No one dared. Elena sat at the console, her eyes glued to her data feed. Kira was still on the comms, her breathing shallow but steady. Ortega had gone silent. The hum persisted. Steady. Rhythmic. Everywhere. Andrew's eyes flickered to the tactical screen. More white dots had appeared. Not red. Not blue. White. They were everywhere now. Elena wiped a hand down her face, exhausted but still working. Andrew, she said, her voice breaking slightly. The signal. It's not ours anymore. I know, he said quietly. No, I don't think you do, she muttered, her eyes wide. It's not ours anymore. It's not the Cliveth's either. Andrew slowly turned toward her. Then whose is it? Elena swallowed, hands shaking as she tapped her datapad. It's coming from all of us. Every comm device, every active emitter, every neural feedback system still linked to the breakpoint network. Her gaze met his. We're the signal now. Andrew leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. His fingers tapped the armrest. Tap, tap, tap. His thoughts raced, but one thought rose above all the rest. They're not taking over us. They're waiting for us to understand. He blinked, staring at the tactical map. The white dots weren't just Cliveth units anymore. There were human markers too. Slowly, the dots began to move together. Not toward the Cliveth. With them. Andrew, Elena said, her voice barely a whisper now. I think we've already merged. His eyes darted toward her, his voice sharp. What do you mean? I mean, she hesitated, then looked him dead in the eye. I mean that if you check your biosignal, you're gonna see it too. Andrew's heart froze. He checked his diagnostics. Biofeedback. The graph showed his heart rate, his oxygen intake, his neural response. And right next to it, displayed in cold, unfeeling numbers, was a signal. The exact same pattern as the Cliveth broadcast. Oh no, he whispered, eyes wide. Oh no, no, no. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the floor, his chair, his bones. Then, like a whisper in his own mind, a voice echoed. Hello, Andrew. He spun in his chair, but no one was there. Who's there? He shouted. The hum stopped. A voice replied, clear, calm, and all too familiar. You are. 96 hours later. The world had changed. Not with fire. Not with thunder. Not with the crash of war. Changed in silence. Andrew Carter stood at the edge of the forward observation deck at Outpost Epsilon. His eyes locked on the horizon. Beyond the twisted wreckage of abandoned Cliveth war machines, he could see them, the white line. Hundreds, no, thousands of Cliveth units standing side by side, their chitinous forms still as statues. But they weren't idle. They were waiting. Some were humanoid in shape like soldiers. Others were larger, multi-limbed siege units. Their spindly legs arched like towers over the landscape. Further back were the colossal warwalkers, their frames like skyscrapers of armor and machinery. All of them, every single one, stood in formation facing the human lines. They didn't move. They didn't attack. They just watched. Humans watched back. Soldiers behind barricades and bunkers kept their rifles aimed, fingers hovering over triggers. They didn't trust it. No one did. Nothing's changed, Kira muttered from beside him, her breath fogging the air. She gripped her plasma rifle, her knuckles pale under her gloves. For days, and they just stand there. You really think this is a good sign, Carter? Andrew didn't answer. His gaze didn't shift from the horizon. Carter, she said, her tone hardening. I need to know you're still in control. You've been quiet since the broadcast. His eyes flicked toward her slowly. She tensed. She hadn't meant to say it like that, but it was too late. The broadcast, he repeated, his voice hollow but steady. Yeah. Her eyes narrowed. That was you, wasn't it? Andrew turned away, his eyes locked on the white line. He didn't answer, but that silence was an answer all on its own. 4 days ago, the broadcast. The hum wasn't just a sound anymore. It had a voice. Andrew sat at the center of the command chair, his eyes half-lidded, sweat dripping down his face. His fingers hovered over the controls but didn't move. His heart rate was steady. Too steady. Monitors around him flickered with error messages, neural feedback alerts, and biometric warnings. Elena was shouting at him. Her words were sharp, frantic, but her voice sounded so far away. Andrew, shut it off. Do you hear me? Shut it off. She slammed her hands on the console in front of him, her face inches from his, her eyes wild with terror. They're syncing with us. They're syncing with you. His eyes flicked to hers, slow, deliberate, and too calm. They're not syncing, he said. His voice layered with an odd resonance. It wasn't just his voice. It was like a second voice was speaking with him, hidden just beneath his own. They're joining. No, Elena hissed, her voice sharp with panic. No, they're copying you, Andrew. That's not the same thing. If you let them sync, you won't be you anymore. Do you understand me? You won't be you. Andrew tilted his head, his gaze distant like he was listening to something she couldn't hear. Maybe that's the point, he said softly. Her face crumpled with horror. Don't do this. The hum grew louder. We see you, Andrew. The voice echoed through every speaker, every comm line, every radio frequency still active. It wasn't just his voice anymore. It was many voices. Men, women, children, soldiers, civilians. Voices from old broadcasts, from emergency alerts, from radio transmissions from the first days of the invasion. They all spoke at once. We see you. Elena's eyes darted around the room as she whispered. Oh no. The voice continued. We are you. Andrew's breathing slowed. His eyes blinked once. Slowly, calmly, Elena reached forward, gripping his arm, her nails digging into him. Andrew, I'm begging you. Turn it off. Turn it off before. He looked at her. No fear, no doubt, just certainty. We are us, Andrew said, his voice perfectly in sync with the broadcast. And then he flipped the final switch. Back to present day. They're not copying me, Kira, Andrew said, still watching the white line. They're not copying anyone anymore. Kira gave him a long, searching look. Her grip on the plasma rifle tightened. Then what are they, huh? She asked, taking a step forward, her tone sharp, accusatory. What are they, Carter? If they're not Cliveth, if they're not human, what are they? He didn't answer at first. His eyes scanned the distant Cliveth forms, each one standing perfectly still in the field, like pieces on a chessboard waiting for a move. They're the space in between, he said quietly. Not Cliveth. Not human. Something else. Kira frowned. That doesn't tell me a damn thing, Carter. They don't have to be one or the other anymore, he said. His voice steady but distant. That was our mistake. We thought it was us or them. We thought we were separate. We thought they were invaders. Yeah, because they were. Andrew, Kira snapped, eyes blazing with anger. They killed billions of us, in case you forgot. I didn't forget, he replied, finally turning to face her. His eyes were sharp, clear, but there was something off about them. Not broken, not hollow, just focused. I didn't forget, he repeated. But they didn't forget either. Forget what? She snarled, taking a step forward. Forget what, Carter? Andrew tilted his head, his gaze heavy on hers. Pain, he said simply. They felt it too. Kira stopped mid-step. Her breath caught in her throat. They felt it, Andrew continued, his voice slow, deliberate. Every time we broke their signal. Every time we fractured the hive mind, it hurt them. They didn't know how to feel it at first, but over time, they learned. Pain, confusion, isolation. His gaze bore into hers. Just like us. Her hands shook. No, she muttered, stepping back. Her eyes flicked to his hands. They weren't moving, but she saw the subtle twitch of his fingers. The same twitching rhythm she'd seen in the Cliveth soldiers. Tap, tap, tap. No, don't you dare. You're not them, Andrew. You're not them. He didn't blink. I'm not just them, he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that made her chest tighten. I'm not just me either. Her breathing quickened. She raised her rifle, eyes locked on him. Back up, Carter, she said, her voice wavering. Back up. Don't, he said quietly, tilting his head again. His gaze wasn't angry. It wasn't afraid. It was the look of someone who had already accepted something you hadn't. If you fire, you'll just be proving them right. Her heart pounded in her chest. Her finger hovered on the trigger. Proving what? Huh? She growled, her eyes wild. Proving what, Carter? He stared at her for a long, slow moment. Then his lips parted. His voice was soft, like a whisper from a dream. That fear makes us weak, he said. But pain makes us whole. Her finger twitched on the trigger. But she didn't pull it. The hum returned. Low, deep, resonating in her chest. It wasn't coming from Andrew. It wasn't coming from the Cliveth. It was everywhere. She heard voices. Not words. Just sounds. Breathing. Heartbeats. Taps of fingers on metal. Taps. 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 Rhythmic. Intentional. Andrew stepped forward. Slowly. Gently. Her breath hitched as his hand rested on the barrel of her rifle. Don't be afraid, Kira, he said. His voice low, calm, and all too familiar. You're one of us now. Her eyes widened. The hum grew louder. She didn't lower the rifle. But she didn't pull the trigger either. 120 hours later. The world was no longer silent. It wasn't the hum anymore. No, that had changed. The hum had become something more. It wasn't just a vibration in the air. It was rhythm, beat, pulse. It was in the way people spoke, the way their fingers tapped, the way their breaths synced up without them realizing. It was in everything, and it was only getting louder. Outpost Epsilon. Andrew Carter stood in the command center, watching the monitors flicker with dozens of live feeds from across the globe. Each screen showed a different location, but they all shared the same image. Cliveth and humans standing side by side. They weren't fighting. They weren't even tense anymore. In some places, human soldiers and Cliveth soldiers stood together in defensive formations. In others, they worked in eerie synchrony to rebuild barricades and secure strongholds. No one had ordered them to do it. No one had told the humans to lower their weapons. They just did. Carter, Kira's voice buzzed in his ear. She'd stopped using his first name. It had been hours since she last called him Andrew. Her voice had lost its edge, but not its wariness. This isn't right. He stayed silent, eyes locked on the screen. Did you hear me? She asked, sharper now. This isn't right. I heard you, he replied, his voice calm, almost too calm. She growled into the calm, look at them. Look at them. That's not a truce, Carter. That's not peace. That's something else. I know, he said softly, his eyes flicking to one of the feeds. It was Outpost Zulu. He watched as 3 human engineers worked side by side with 2 Cliveth. The engineers lifted heavy support beams while the Cliveth reinforced the joints with some kind of biological adhesive secreted from their limbs. No words were spoken. No orders were given. They just moved together like a team that had been training for years. Kira's voice cut in again. It's the signal, isn't it? she asked, her voice tinged with something between fury and fear. They're all synced up. Not just the bugs. Us too. Tell me I'm wrong. Andrew exhaled, long and slow, like a man letting go of something heavy he'd been holding for too long. You're not wrong, he admitted. Her response was immediate. Then shut it off. I can't, he said quietly. You mean you won't? Her voice was cold now. Icy. Hard. Same thing, he replied. There was silence on the other end of the line. But not the calm kind of silence. The kind of silence where you know someone is deciding whether or not to pull the trigger. Outpost Theta. Reyes stood on the edge of the defense wall, his rifle held tight in his hands. His breathing was shallow. His heart pounded like a drum in his chest. But he wasn't scared anymore. Not like he used to be. The Cliveth were here. Not approaching. Not charging. They were already inside the perimeter. 7 of them. They stood just a few meters from Reyes and the other soldiers. Not attacking. Not even moving aggressively. They stood, back straight, heads tilted, arms hanging at their sides like they were waiting. The other soldiers around him whispered nervously. Why aren't they moving? Are they waiting for orders? Just give me the word, and I'll drop them. Reyes wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on one of them, the one who had spoken his name. It was still there, still watching him, still looking at him. Not at his gun, not at his armor. It was looking at his face, like it was trying to see something behind his eyes. He didn't know why he did it, but he stepped forward. Just one step, close enough to see his own reflection in its multi-lensed eyes. Its lenses shifted, focused on him. He tightened his grip on his rifle. His breath was slow, measured. Tap, tap, tap. The fingers of his left hand tapped a rhythm on the rifle's stock. The Cliveth's head tilted slowly, its gaze flicking to his tapping fingers. Then, with a smooth, deliberate motion, it raised one of its 4 arms. Tap, tap, tap. The Cliveth mimicked his rhythm perfectly. Reyes's breath hitched. He backed up half a step, eyes wide. No, he muttered. No, you don't get to do that. The Cliveth didn't move. Its lenses shifted back to him. Watching. Waiting. Reyes, stand down, his sergeant barked. Get back behind the line. But he didn't move. He just stood there, face to face with it, heart pounding, eyes locked with its own. Do you feel it? Reyes asked, his voice barely a whisper. Do you feel it now? The Cliveth's head tilted the other way. Yeah, Reyes muttered, his voice shaking with something that wasn't fear. I think you do. Back at Outpost Epsilon. Ortega's not responding, Elena said. Her voice strained as she flipped through data feeds. I've got no signal from HQ. Last message was 5 hours ago. Don't bother, Andrew muttered. HQ's gone. She glanced at him, her eyes wide with confusion. Gone? How do you know that? He tapped his temple slowly, his gaze distant. They're not part of the rhythm. Her breath caught in her chest. What do you mean by that, Andrew? He turned to face her, his eyes calm but heavy, like he'd already accepted something she wasn't ready to. You hear it? Don't you? He asked, taking a step toward her. That little tap in the back of your head. The one that makes you blink in rhythm. The one that makes you breathe in perfect sync with everyone else. Her eyes darted side to side. Her breath caught. She did hear it. You're not hearing it, Elena, he said softly. You are it. No, she whispered, eyes wide. No, that's just stress. That's just nerves. That's... Listen, Andrew said, his voice a razor-sharp whisper. And she did. She heard it in the hum of the power conduits, the static on the comm lines, the distant thumps of boots in the hallways. Tap, tap, tap. It was the same rhythm. Her eyes shot to Andrew's hands. Tap, tap, tap. She backed away, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "You're not him anymore," she muttered, her voice cracking. "You're not Andrew." He tilted his head at her. His eyes blinked once, twice. On the third blink, they stayed closed a moment too long. When he opened them, she gasped. His eyes weren't his anymore. They shimmered with faint, faceted reflections, like Cliveth eyes hidden beneath human pupils. "I am Andrew," he said, his voice layered with that same, awful dual resonance. "I am Cliveth. I am Reyes. I am you. I am us." Elena's back hit the wall. Her datapad fell from her hands, clattering to the ground. "No," she whispered. "No, no, 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 no." Andrew stepped forward, one slow, measured step. "There is no I anymore, Elena," he said, his tone gentle but undeniable. "There is only we." She reached for the emergency override on the wall, eyes wild with desperation. Andrew watched her calmly. "You can shut it down," he said, nodding to the override switch. "But it's too late." Her fingers hovered over the switch, shaking like a leaf. "Don't do this, Andrew," she begged. "Please." He stepped closer, raising a hand, palm open. Her eyes flicked to his fingers. Tap, tap, tap. Her breath stuttered. Her fingers hovered over the switch for one more second. But she didn't press it. Her breathing steadied. Her eyes cleared. Her fingers tapped the wall. Tap, tap, tap. Andrew smiled softly. "There you are," he whispered, his voice calm and welcoming. "Now you see." And together they watched the horizon as the Cliveth, the humans, and the white dots on the map all moved together. Not apart, not at war, as one. 144 hours later, there were no battle lines anymore. No human side, no Cliveth side, just white dots. They moved together now, not as invaders, not as defenders, just together. The tactical maps that once displayed fields of red, blue, and green, friendly, enemy, and neutral forces, were now a sea of white pulses, moving in perfect synchrony like a global heartbeat. No one issued commands. No one gave orders. But everyone knew exactly what to do. Outpost Epsilon Command Center. The lights flickered as power from the emitters surged. Energy readings spiked across the board, but no one moved to stop it. Elena sat in the corner, her back against the wall, knees pulled to her chest. Her eyes were wide, locked on Andrew Carter as he stood in front of the central command console. He wasn't touching it. He didn't need to. The screens shifted on their own. Data feeds appeared, flickered, then disappeared. Tactical displays zoomed in, rotated, then expanded again. The system was responding to him, not by touch but by presence alone. Every movement of his eyes, every slight shift of his head. The system followed him like a servant following a king. "Andrew," Elena whispered, her voice dry and hoarse. "You can still stop it." He didn't answer. Her eyes locked on his fingers, hanging loose at his sides. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm was soft, but it was there. Always there. Her heart matched it now. No matter how much she tried to slow it, control it, it always found its way back to that beat. Tap, tap, tap. "Andrew," she said again, louder this time, pushing herself up to her feet. "You're still you. I know you're still in there. You don't have to let this happen." He blinked slowly, his eyes opening a beat later than they should have. When his gaze met hers, her stomach turned. Faceted reflections. Barely visible. Barely noticeable. But once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. He tilted his head slightly, his movements slower, more deliberate than before. His lips moved, but his voice wasn't his own. Not fully. We are not letting anything happen, Elena. The words echoed, not in the room but in her mind. Her breath hitched. Her eyes darted to the comm console. Her fingers twitched toward it, but Andrew tilted his head just a little further, his gaze heavy on her. You don't have to run, he said softly, his voice calm, kind even. But there was something in the way he said it. Not a threat, not a command, just knowledge. Her hand stopped. Do you feel it yet? He asked, taking a slow step toward her. His boots echoed softly, each step perfectly in rhythm with that relentless beat. It's in you now, Elena. I know you can feel it. Her heart beat faster. Her breaths came in short, shallow bursts. No, don't listen to him. Don't listen to it. You're afraid, he continued, his gaze steady, but there was no malice in it, just certainty. Tap, tap, tap. You're afraid because you think you'll lose yourself? Her fingers twitched. She felt her arm move an inch toward the comm override. But you're wrong, Andrew said, his voice layered, his tone gentle like a parent talking to a scared child. You won't lose yourself, Elena. You'll be more. Her breathing stopped. Her eyes widened, lips trembling. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, I'm not like you. He stepped closer, slowly, carefully, like approaching a wild animal. You already are. Her back hit the wall. Her fingers curled into fists. She squeezed her eyes shut. Don't listen, don't listen, don't listen. But when she opened them again, he was closer. His eyes shimmered with that faint, insect-like glow. You hear it? Don't you? He said, his voice so quiet, so calm. He raised a hand slowly, slowly, so slowly, until his fingers hovered just a few inches from her face. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. That hum in the back of your mind. It's not noise, Elena. It's us calling you home. Her lips trembled. You're lying. Am I? He asked, his gaze locking onto hers. Her breath hitched. Her heart was pounding, but something felt off. It wasn't pounding. It was tapping. Tap, tap, tap. The realization hit her like ice water down her back. Her breath had already fallen into rhythm. Her fingers were tapping against her leg, without her even noticing. Her heart, her mind, her everything. No, she muttered, tears welling in her eyes. No, you don't get to do this to me. I'm still me. I'm still me. Andrew tilted his head, his face softening into a gentle smile. We know, across the world. It wasn't a takeover. Takeovers are loud, violent, sudden. This wasn't like that. This was a sinking. On every battlefield, human soldiers lowered their weapons. Not because they were afraid. Not because they were surrendering. They just didn't need them anymore. The Cliveth, once towering and menacing, no longer moved like predators. They moved like partners. No longer invaders. No longer enemies. White dots moved in perfect formations. No distinction between human and Cliveth. Not anymore. Outpost Zulu, 1400 hours local time. Reyes stood at the base of the eastern wall, his rifle hanging from his shoulder, untouched. Beside him, 2 Cliveth soldiers watched the horizon with him, their legs bent in resting stances. One of them looked at him. Reyes glanced back. He didn't look away. Yeah, I know, he muttered, tapping his fingers on the stock of his rifle. Tap, tap, tap. The Cliveth tilted its head, its multi-lensed eyes rotating, clicking softly. It raised a single arm and tapped its fingers against its chitinous thigh. Tap, tap, tap. He watched it for a long moment. Then he smiled. Not so different, huh? He said quietly. The Cliveth didn't respond. But it didn't need to. Back at Outpost Epsilon, Elena stood in the middle of the room, breathing slowly, steadily. Andrew stood in front of her, watching, waiting. His gaze wasn't sharp anymore. It wasn't cold. It was warm. It was like looking at someone who'd finally figured something out. Someone who'd been searching for a long, long time and had finally found an answer. Elena's eyes flicked to the override switch one last time. "Do it," Andrew said, nodding toward the switch. "If you want to. You're still you, Elena. You can stop it. You can end all of it." Her eyes darted to his face. He raised his hands, showing her his palms. Tap, tap, tap. Her gaze softened. "Or," he said quietly, his voice like a lullaby, "you can see it through." Her fingers hovered over the switch, heart pounding in her chest. No, not pounding. It was tapping. Tap, tap, tap. Her eyes flicked back to Andrew, and she finally saw it. Not just him. Not just Cliveth. Not just herself. All of them. Together. Her hand dropped away from the switch. Her breathing slowed. Her eyes closed for just a moment. When she opened them, she wasn't afraid anymore. Andrew smiled. "You see it now, don't you?" he asked softly. Her lips quivered. "Yeah," she whispered, her eyes clearing like fog lifting after a storm. "Yeah, I see it." Her gaze flicked to the screen. The world map. Every blip, every marker, all white dots. "Do you feel it?" he asked, stepping forward. She nodded, eyes glassy but steady. "Yeah," she said. "I feel it." Tap, tap, tap. She tilted her head, listening to the hum, to the pulse, to the us. "What do we do now?" she asked quietly. Andrew's smile widened just slightly. "Now," he said, looking at the screen, at every outpost, every city, every human, every Cliveth, every dot. "Now we build something new." 168 hours later. The world wasn't broken anymore. It wasn't healed either. Healed implies something was restored to the way it was before. This was something new. Something that had never existed before now. There were no sides anymore. No us or them. No human or Cliveth. There was only one rhythm. No borders. No factions. Just dots. White dots. Scattered across every tactical map. Flowing like the gentle currents of a vast ocean. They didn't clash. They didn't collide. They moved in sync. They moved together. Outpost Epsilon control room. Elena stood at the main console, her eyes scanning the world map. The dots were shifting, moving in steady, controlled patterns, but it was no longer like a war map. It looked more like watching migration routes or neural pathways firing in sync. Human and Cliveth units moved as one, not as soldiers or enemies, but as something greater. They rebuilt together. They shared resources. Sometimes humans picked up debris. Sometimes Cliveth lifted steel beams. No orders were needed. None were given. "They're organizing," Elena muttered aloud, her eyes tracking the shifting dots on the screen. "Building something." Her voice wasn't as sharp as it had been days ago. It had softened. Her shoulders were loose. Her breathing steady. She barely even realized she was tapping her fingertips on the console. Tap, tap, tap. Andrew Carter stood behind her, arms folded, watching her with calm intensity. He didn't say anything right away. He just observed. "You're getting it," he said finally, his voice layered with that familiar dual-tone resonance. His voice, but not just his voice. Her fingers stopped tapping. Her head tilted slowly. Her eyes narrowed, a flicker of that old defiance trying to resurface. "Getting it? You think this is something I'm supposed to get?" "Not supposed to," Andrew replied, stepping closer. His movements were slow, smooth, controlled. Each step perfectly measured. No excess energy wasted. No uncertainty. No hesitation. "You already do," he said. Elena felt it. She knew it was true. Deep down she knew. Her breath, her pulse, even the way her muscles twitched in response to his words. It all aligned with that ever-present beat. Tap, tap, tap. Don't do this, she whispered, taking a step back. But it wasn't as forceful as it had been days ago. There was no fire left in her voice. No true resistance. Just a final thread of doubt holding her together. Do what? He asked, spreading his arms wide like he was opening himself up to her. His eyes shimmered with that faint, multi-lensed glow. This isn't something I'm doing, Elena. It's something we're doing. You feel it now, don't you? Her eyes darted to the screen. The white dots, the calm movements, the synchronization. Yes. Her heart ached, and her eyes squeezed shut. I'm still me, she hissed, clenching her fists. I'm still me, Andrew. You are, he said, stepping forward. His gaze filled with nothing but patience. You always will be. Her eyes shot open, burning with fury. She raised her finger, pointing at him like a blade. Then why do I feel like you're trying to erase me? Andrew tilted his head. His eyes blinked slowly, like he was processing her words in ways no human ever could. Erase you, he repeated, his voice soft. We're not erasing you, Elena. We're making you more. Her breathing stopped. Her fingers twitched again, and her eyes darted to her hands. Her fingers tapped. Tap, tap, tap. Her eyes filled with tears. I don't want to be a part of this, Andrew. You already are. Outpost Theta, ground level. Reyes leaned against the wall, one boot propped up behind him. The rifle at his side hung loosely from its sling, but he wasn't holding it. He hadn't needed to in hours. Not with them standing next to him. A Cliveth soldier stood beside him. No, not stood. It was postured. His frame wasn't stiff or robotic anymore. It stood casually, its forearms hanging at its sides, its legs slightly bent as though it had figured out how to rest. The creature glanced at him occasionally, like a friend checking to see if the person next to them was still paying attention. Reyes glanced back at it, tilted its head. He tilted his. You know, you freak me out, Reyes muttered, squinting at it. The Cliveth tilted its head back the other way, just a fraction of a second slower than his own movement. But I can't even blame you for it. I think you're just copying me. The Cliveth didn't respond. Not with words, at least. Instead, it raised one of its lower arms and tapped its clawed fingers on the wall. Tap, tap, tap. Reyes froze. His fingers instinctively started tapping against his thigh in the exact same rhythm. His eyes locked on the Cliveth's multi-lensed eyes. The lenses shifted, clicked softly as they refocused on his face. His heart pounded. But it wasn't fear. It wasn't panic. It was sync. Yeah, he muttered, exhaling slowly. That's what I thought. He didn't stop tapping. Back at Outpost Epsilon, Elena sat on the edge of the console, her head resting in her hands. Her fingers tangled in her hair as she let out a long, slow breath. Her heart had stopped racing. Her eyes weren't wide with fear anymore. She was calm. Too calm. Do you know what scares me the most? She asked quietly. Andrew stood across from her, his gaze steady, his breath perfectly in sync with hers. Tell me. She shook her head slowly, her voice distant, almost hollow. It's not that you're in my head. It's not that I can hear it anymore. It's that I don't want it to stop. Her hands fell to her lap. Her fingers tapped. Tap, tap, tap. Tears ran down her face. Her voice cracked with a laugh that sounded more like a sob. God, listen to me. I sound like you. You sound like us? Andrew said softly, his voice carrying that unmistakable resonance. She looked at him, and for the first time she didn't look away. I fought so hard, she said, her voice quiet but steady. I fought so hard to stay human. And you still are, he replied, walking toward her. You didn't lose anything, Elena. You didn't give anything up. You're still you. Then why do I feel so different? She asked, voice breaking. Andrew knelt in front of her, his gaze level with hers. His eyes glowed faintly, but not in a threatening way. It was like the glow of a nightlight in a child's bedroom. Soft, warm, comforting. Because, he whispered, his voice full of something that felt so much like love that it hurt. Because you're not alone anymore. Her breath hitched. Her fingers tapped. Tap, tap, tap. Tears fell freely down her face, and she didn't bother wiping them away. Andrew reached out, slowly, giving her every chance to stop him. She didn't. He placed his hand on hers. No force. No pressure, just contact. Their fingers twitched, then tapped in perfect sync. Tap, tap, tap. Her breathing slowed. Her tears stopped. Her eyes closed. Her lips parted with one final whisper. I hear it. Andrew smiled softly, eyes calm as still water. We all do. Her eyes opened. They weren't just her eyes anymore. She saw everything. The soldiers at the wall, the Cliveth tapping on steel, Reyes leaning next to his partner, the white line shifting not with conflict, but with purpose. The rhythm was everywhere. Elena looked back at Andrew, her face clear of doubt, her eyes shimmering with facets of something new. What do we do now? She asked, her voice quiet but steady. Andrew's eyes shifted to the console, watching the white dots on the map move in perfect, elegant flows. Now, he said, his voice filled with certainty. His fingers tapped gently against the metal. Tap, tap, tap. Now we show them how to build a world without fear. 192 hours later, the world had stopped fighting. No gunfire, no airstrikes, no desperate last stands. There were no last stands anymore. On every battlefield, soldiers and Cliveth alike walked together, side by side. They didn't speak, but they didn't have to. Movements were understood without words. Gestures, glances, and the steady, unrelenting tap, tap, tap that echoed through every outpost, every city, every mind. It wasn't a sound anymore. It was them. Outpost Zulu reconstruction site. Reyes hoisted the last steel support beam into place, his muscles straining for only a moment before a pair of Cliveth arms reached up to steady it. His breathing slowed, his heart beat in rhythm with every motion, every lift, every movement. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of Cliveth claws tapping the beam mirrored the rhythm in his chest. The sensation wasn't eerie anymore. It was comforting. You got it? He asked, his voice calm but firm. The Cliveth turned its head to look at him. It tilted its head slowly, and its multi-lensed eyes clicked, shifting focus until it was looking directly into his face. Yeah, Reyes muttered with a wry grin. You got it. The Cliveth's fingers tapped the beam 3 more times, then pressed it firmly into place. Its head tilted just a bit further, watching Reyes with something almost familiar. Recognition. Stop looking at me like that, Reyes muttered, climbing down the scaffold. I know, all right? I know. He reached the ground, boots crunching softly against dirt and metal debris. His eyes flicked toward the field beyond the outpost where more Cliveth moved, carrying heavy loads, reinforcing outposts, helping to stabilize old structures that humans had been struggling to fix for months. A few human soldiers watched them work. They weren't aiming their weapons anymore. They were just watching. One of the soldiers, a woman named Collins, glanced at Reyes, her eyes darting to the Cliveth worker beside him. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. You really trust that thing? She asked, hands resting on her belt. Reyes glanced up at the Cliveth, who stood silently, tapping its claws on the edge of the beam. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was steady, purposeful. Yeah, Reyes replied without hesitation. More than I trust some people. Colin scoffed, but she didn't argue. Her eyes lingered on the Cliveth for a moment longer before she turned and walked away. The Cliveth glanced at Reyes again. Don't look at me like that, he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. You know I'm right. The Cliveth tilted its head. Tap, tap, tap. Outpost Epsilon Command Center. Elena stood at the edge of the observation deck, her eyes fixed on the skyline. It was still a mess of ruin and wreckage, but she could see something different now. People were moving, not running, not hiding, building. The Cliveth were there too, working alongside them. Some lifted heavy steel beams. Others used their biological adhesives to seal cracks in damaged concrete. No orders had been given. No one had issued commands. It was just happening. Did you think it would look like this? Andrew asked, stepping up behind her. His voice was calm, layered, but she could hear more of him now. Not just the us that had overtaken him before. No, Elena admitted, glancing sideways at him. She didn't step back. She didn't flinch. She just watched him. I thought it would be worse. His eyes, still touched with that faint, multi-lensed shimmer, stayed on her. Does it feel worse? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked back at the skyline. She watched as the white dots on the tactical display shifted, moved, and synchronized with every step taken on the ground. It wasn't chaos anymore. It was design. No, she muttered, leaning on the edge of the console. No, it doesn't. Her eyes flicked toward the override switch on the wall, the one she'd nearly pulled 3 days ago. It was still there, still active, still within reach. But she didn't reach for it. Not anymore. Do you understand it now? Andrew asked, stepping beside her. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking out at the same skyline. Elena didn't answer right away. She tapped her fingers on the edge of the console, slowly, deliberately. Tap, tap, tap. She stopped, realizing what she was doing. Her fingers hovered, tense, but then she let them fall and tapped the rhythm again. Tap, tap, tap. Her eyes locked onto his, her gaze hard but calm. Yeah, she said quietly. Yeah, I do. Andrew smiled. Global transmission, day 8. No alarms blared. No sirens wailed. But every comm system on the planet blinked at once. Radios, emergency broadcasts, and even disconnected devices lit up with soft static. Screens flickered to life, showing no image but filling the air with a familiar, rhythmic pulse. Tap, tap, tap. Then the static resolved into a voice. Not one voice, many voices. Men, women, children, soldiers, Cliveth, all at once speaking as one. This is not surrender. The message echoed across every frequency. This is not control. Soldiers lowered their weapons. Workers paused in the middle of their shifts. Children turned toward screens, faces filled with quiet awe. This is something new. On the ground at Outpost Gamma, a soldier named Hart stared at his comm unit as it crackled with static, then silence. He looked at the Cliveth standing near him, one of its arms resting on a support beam. The Cliveth glanced at him, its head tilting slowly. They watched each other. Tap, tap, tap. Hart exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against his rifle. The Cliveth tapped the beam. They moved in sync. Outpost Epsilon, observation deck. Elena watched it all happen. The broadcast, the silence that followed. The soldiers and Cliveth turning toward each other as if waiting for a cue. As if waiting for someone to say something. They're going to be afraid, she said softly, eyes still on the horizon. People aren't going to understand it. Andrew nodded, stepping beside her, his eyes calm but sharp. At first, yeah, but fear doesn't last. You sure about that? She asked, her tone dry but genuine. He tilted his head, gazing at her with eyes that shimmered faintly, like glass catching the sun. I'm sure, he said, because I felt it too. Her breathing steadied. Her fingers tapped again. Tap, tap, tap. Then what happens now? She asked, folding her arms, staring at the skyline. She glanced sideways at him, her eyes clear, sharp, but no longer afraid. What do we do now, Andrew? He breathed in slowly, deeply, like a man savoring fresh air after holding his breath for too long. His gaze swept over the world map, the white dots moving in elegant, fluid pathways. Every human, every cliveth, all moving together. Now, he said, his eyes focused on something far ahead. Now we stop surviving. His gaze turned to her. Faceted eyes, human warmth. Now we evolve. Elena glanced at him, a long, slow look that stretched between them like the last breath before a plunge. Her eyes shifted back to the horizon, and for the first time she didn't feel afraid. Her fingers tapped in perfect sync. Tap, tap, tap. Her heart tapped too. So did his. So did theirs. Everywhere. Everyone. All at once. Tap, tap, tap. Transmission complete. There were no more words. No more orders. Only movement. Humans and Cliveth working together, walking in perfect rhythm toward the same goal. Not to fight. Not to run. But to build. Something new. 216 hours later. The hum had changed again. It wasn't the low thrum of machinery. It wasn't the mechanical buzz of Cliveth communications. It wasn't even the steady, ever-present tap, tap, tap that had echoed in human minds for days. No, this was different. This was a song. It wasn't a song with melody or words. It was deeper, subconscious, felt, not heard. Every human, every Cliveth, every creature connected to the network could feel it thrumming in their bones, their breaths sinking to it. The world had changed once again. But this time, no one fought it. Outpost Epsilon, Day 9. Elena stood on the command deck, her hands resting on the metal railing as she gazed out over the skyline. Beyond the crumbled remains of old structures, something new was rising. A spire. It wasn't made of steel or concrete. It wasn't human-made, but it wasn't Cliveth-made either. It was both. The base of the spire was reinforced steel and rebar, welded together by human hands. But higher up, it shifted. The materials changed. Organic plates of chitin-like armor twisted and curled upward, blending with the metal. Thin strands of Cliveth biofiber wove through the metalwork like veins in marble. The structure shimmered faintly in the midday sun, the organic plates catching the light with an iridescent glow. Humans worked alongside Cliveth, lifting beams and plates into position. No one argued. No one barked orders. They simply moved, synchronized, wordless, flawless. Look at them, Elena muttered, her voice distant but steady. They don't even need blueprints anymore. Andrew Carter stood next to her, silent, his eyes focused on the construction below. He didn't answer right away. His gaze was too far away, like he was seeing more than she could. There the blueprint, he said softly, his voice carrying that familiar resonance. It was his voice, but there was something more to it now. Like there was a second voice hidden beneath it. Or maybe more than two. Elena glanced at him, her eyes narrowing. How long are you going to keep pretending you're still Andrew Carter? He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the spire. I am Andrew Carter, he said simply. He turned to face her slowly, his eyes meeting hers with that same unshakable calm. And I'm also us, Her jaw clenched. Her fingers twitched. "Don't," she said, her eyes narrowing. "Don't give me that. I knew Andrew Carter. I knew who he was. And you're not him anymore." Andrew tilted his head, his gaze soft but steady. "He's still here," he said, tapping his chest lightly. Tap, tap, tap. "I didn't lose him, Elena. I became more of him. Just like you will." Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't respond right away. Her fingers curled into fists, nails pressing against her palms. "Don't do that," she muttered, turning away from him. "Don't talk like you've got it all figured out. You don't." Andrew didn't move. He just watched her, his eyes patient, understanding. "Fear always speaks first," he said quietly. "I know. I felt it too." Her hands trembled. She turned sharply, pointing at him. "No, you don't get to act like you're still just Andrew, okay? You're not him. You're not you. You're—" Her voice caught. Her throat tightened. Her eyes widened as she realized something. She didn't finish the sentence. Her voice had stopped on its own. "Why did I stop?" she thought, heart pounding. But it wasn't pounding anymore. It was tapping. Her hands fell to her sides. Her fingers twitched. Tap, tap, tap. Her breath slowed, her chest rising and falling in time with the tapping. Her gaze flicked toward the override switch on the wall. It was still there. It had always been there. But she didn't move toward it. She didn't even want to. Her fingers tapped in time with her heartbeat, and she finally understood. "You never took control, did you?" she said softly, her voice trembling. Her eyes darted to Andrew, then back to the skyline where the spire rose higher and higher. "We did this to ourselves." "We always do," Andrew replied, stepping closer, his hands resting on the railing beside hers. His fingers tapped lightly. Tap, tap, tap. "But this time, it's not a mistake." Outpost Theta, ground level. Reyes stood with his back against the wall, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder. His helmet sat on the ground next to him. He didn't need it anymore. No one did. He glanced at the Cliveth worker standing across from him. It was resting too, its forearms draped over its body like it was waiting for something. Its head tilted toward him. Its eyes locked onto his. "Don't look at me like that," Reyes muttered, pointing at it. "I'm serious." The Cliveth tilted its head further. "I mean it," he said, tapping his fingers on the wall behind him. Tap, tap, tap. His fingers stopped as soon as he realized what he was doing. "Stop that. You hear me?" The Cliveth lifted one of its claws, tapping the ground lightly. Tap, tap, tap. Reyes rolled his eyes. "You think you're funny, huh?" The Cliveth didn't answer. It just kept tapping. He glanced at his hands, still twitching, still tapping against his rifle stock. No matter how many times he told himself to stop, his fingers wouldn't listen. He sighed, wiping sweat from his brow. Yeah, he muttered, glancing at the Cliveth. "I get it. I feel it too." The Cliveth shifted, its head tilted just slightly further, its eyes focusing on him with a new sharpness. Reyes's breath slowed. He'd seen that look before. Not from Cliveth. From people. It was the look people gave each other when they finally understood something. "Yeah," he muttered again. "You're starting to look more like us every day." The Cliveth raised its claw again, tapping once on the wall beside him. Tap, tap, tap. Reyes stared at it for a moment. Then, slowly he raised his hand and tapped back. Tap, tap, tap. They both sat in silence for a while after that. Global broadcast, day 9. No alarms. No sirens. Just the song. It echoed across every active channel, every screen, every speaker, every comm device. It wasn't a command. It wasn't an order. It was an invitation. A voice came through, calm and clear. Do you see it now? It was Andrew's voice, but not just his. It was Reyes's voice too. It was Kira's voice. It was Elena's voice. It was every voice that had ever spoken on the network, layered into one. There is no war. There is no fear. There is only us. Screens flickered with an image of the spire rising on every continent. Not human. Not Cliveth. Both. Build with us. No further instructions were given. None were needed. Outpost Epsilon final moments. Elena stood on the observation deck, her eyes fixed on the skyline as the sun dipped below the horizon. The glow from the spire cast long, golden beams across the broken city, illuminating every human and every Cliveth working side by side. She didn't feel afraid anymore. Her fingers tapped softly against the console. Tap, tap, tap. Where does it end? She asked, her voice quiet, almost like she didn't want to hear the answer. Andrew stepped forward, his eyes on the horizon, his face filled with something she hadn't seen in years. Hope. It doesn't, he said softly. Not anymore. Her lips parted. Her breath synced to the tap. Tap, tap, tap. And for the first time, Elena didn't fight it. She didn't need to. All right, she whispered, leaning forward, her eyes watching the spire rise higher and higher. Show me. Andrew smiled. We will. 240 hours later. The world didn't end. It didn't fall. It didn't surrender. It changed. Across every continent, every outpost, every city still standing, a single truth had taken root. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't declared. It simply arrived. There is no war. There is no surrender. There is only us. No one argued. Not anymore. Because for the first time in human history, there was no one left to argue with. Not because they were gone, but because they were here. Outpost Epsilon, the observation deck. Elena stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the spire rise higher into the sky. She didn't look away, didn't blink. She watched every piece of it come together like she was seeing something holy. It wasn't like human architecture. It wasn't like Cliveth hives. It was both. And yet it was something else entirely. The bottom of the spire was reinforced with steel, metal plating bolted into place by human hands. Higher up, it shifted into something organic, chitinous plates weaving into the structure like coral growing on a shipwreck. Then, above that, it became something impossible. It shimmered with an iridescent glow that had no business existing in nature. The air around it rippled like heat waves off asphalt. But there was no heat, only presence. Elena couldn't look away. Don't stare too long, Kira said, her voice behind Elena. Sharper than usual, but not cruel. Makes you start thinking too much. Elena didn't turn. Her eyes were locked on the spire. I'm already thinking too much, she muttered. Yeah, that's your problem, Kira replied, stepping up beside her. She leaned against the railing, arms draped over it, eyes narrowed as she glanced at Elena. They're not looking for thinkers, Elena. Elena's eyes shifted toward her, sharp and clear. And what are they looking for, Kira? Kira didn't answer right away. She tilted her head, watching the distant spire rise higher, its glow pulsing in rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. You already know, Kira muttered, nodding toward the spire. Her eyes didn't shimmer like Andrew's. Not yet. But her fingers were tapping against the metal railing without her realizing it. Tap, tap, tap. Elena noticed it. She noticed it everywhere now. Her eyes flicked to the soldiers on the ground. Their fingers drummed on their thighs. Workers tapped their boots on steel walkways. Civilians tapped the handles of tools. Cliveth drones tapped their claws on bulkheads. It was everywhere. Her fingers twitched. Don't tap, she told herself. Don't tap. But the rhythm was already in her. She could stop tapping her fingers, but she couldn't stop feeling it. Global broadcast, day 10. The signal didn't come from a satellite. It didn't come from a command node. It came from everywhere. No one launched it. No one pressed a button. Simply arrived. Screens blinked to life. Radios crackled with static. Emergency broadcast systems activated. Every active device, every dormant speaker, every dead terminal sprang to life. First, it was just a hum. Then the tapping began. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't fast. It wasn't rushed. It was calm. It was steady, like a heartbeat, like footsteps walking down a hallway, like fingers on a table. The tapping played on repeat for 30 seconds. Every person on the planet heard it, whether they wanted to or not. Then, just as the tapping stopped, a voice came through. Not a human voice. Not a Cliveth voice. It was all of them. Men, women, children, soldiers, Cliveth, everyone. We are here. The voice wasn't a shout. It wasn't loud. It was steady, calm, absolute. We are us. The message repeated. No threats, no demands, no calls for surrender, just truth. Outpost Zulu Sector 3. Reyes sat on the edge of a supply crate, his rifle leaning against his knee. He wasn't holding it. His hands rested on his legs, fingers tapping slowly in rhythm with his breathing. Tap, tap, tap. He didn't mean to do it. It just happened. Does it ever stop? Collins asked, sitting across from him, tossing a small metal bolt in the air and catching it. What? Reyes muttered, barely glancing at her. The tapping, she said, tossing the bolt again. Every time I try to sleep, I hear it. Every time I close my eyes, it's just there. Reyes shrugged, his eyes distant. It's not noise, he said. Not really. Then what is it? Collins asked, her eyes narrowing. She caught the bolt, held it tight, her fingers curling around it like a lifeline. Don't give me that, just feel it. Crap. Reyes, I want to know. He glanced at her, his eyes calmer than she'd ever seen them. He looked at her the way you look at someone after they've asked a question that doesn't have an answer, or at least not an answer they want to hear. It's us, he said simply, tapping his fingers on his rifle again. Tap, tap, tap. It's the sound of everything finally fitting together. Collins went still. Her fingers twitched. Then, slowly, they tapped the side of the crate. Tap, tap, tap. Her eyes darted to Reyes. See, he said, leaning back, smiling faintly. You're already part of it. Outpost Epsilon Spire Base. The spire was complete. This glow wasn't bright. It wasn't blinding. It was soft, subtle. It pulsed with every beat of the rhythm. It wasn't a monument. It wasn't a weapon. It was a beacon. Humans and Cliveth gathered at its base, hundreds of them, heads tilted upward as if waiting for something. No one spoke. No one needed to. The air shimmered. Elena stepped forward slowly, her boots crunching against the loose gravel. She stopped at the edge of the crowd, her breath steady, her eyes locked on the glow of the spire. What happens now? She asked, her voice soft, but she wasn't sure who she was talking to. Andrew Carter stepped out of the crowd. No, not just Andrew. His face was still his, but his eyes shimmered with that faceted glow, a glint of Cliveth vision hidden behind human pupils. He moved slowly, deliberately, every step perfectly timed. Tap, tap, tap. His gaze wasn't cold. It was warm, patient. He approached Elena, stopping just a few feet from her. Her eyes met his. For a long, long moment, no one spoke. Then Andrew tilted his head. Just slightly. You still feel like you're alone, he said, his voice kind but firm. That's the last part you're holding on to. Her breath caught in her chest. Her heart pounded. But it wasn't pounding. Tap, tap, tap. Her eyes flicked to the spire. She could feel it now. Not just see it. Feel it. The glow wasn't just light. It was awareness. Her fingers tapped against her thigh, each one in sync with the rhythm. "Don't be afraid," Andrew said softly, his voice carrying with it the weight of everything they had built. "You're not losing anything." Her eyes darted to him. "You're becoming more," he said, and his gaze wasn't pleading. It was certain. Her breathing slowed. Her fingers stopped tapping. Her heart didn't. Her eyes shifted slowly, her gaze focusing on the spire one last time. Her breath steadied. Her hands fell still. Her eyes closed for a moment. Then she opened them. They weren't her eyes anymore. Not just hers. Her breathing synced. Her fingers tapped. Her heart tapped. Her mind tapped. Tap, tap, tap. Andrew stepped beside her. They looked up at the spire together. Not human. Not Cliveth. Something new. "What happens now?" she asked again. Her voice layered with that same resonance. Her eyes clear as the sky. Andrew smiled, and so did every voice in the network. "Now we stop being afraid." Her lips curled into a soft smile. "Yeah," she whispered. "Yeah, I'm ready for that." And for the first time since the war began, the world wasn't afraid anymore. It was together. 264 hours later, the world was no longer divided. No more human and Cliveth. No more invaders or defenders. There were only white dots, moving, pulsing, shifting in perfect rhythm. The old war maps that once tracked enemies and allies were now something else entirely. They were pathways. Flowing, breathing, living pathways. And at the center of those pathways stood the spires. They rose in every city, every stronghold, every outpost. Not built, not grown, but woven. Metal, concrete, and chitin fused together like veins, muscle, and bone, forming something entirely new. The glow from the spires was soft but constant, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. No one called them towers. No one called them hives. They called them beacons. And the world listened. Outpost Epsilon, the spire. Elena walked toward the base of the spire, her boots crunching softly on the gravel path. The air here was warm, not from heat, but from presence. She could feel it on her skin, in her breath, in her bones. Her heart thudded in perfect sync with the glow of the spire. Tap, tap, tap. Her fingers twitched. Her breath matched the beat. It wasn't something she fought anymore. She didn't have to. It wasn't something foreign. It wasn't something wrong. It was just there, like gravity, like sunlight, like the certainty of dawn after a long night. "Does it feel different yet?" Andrew's voice echoed behind her. She glanced over her shoulder. He was standing there, hands in his coat pockets, his eyes softly glowing with that faint, multi-lensed shimmer. Not sharp, not alien, just present. "You keep asking me that," she muttered, turning back toward the spire. Her gaze followed the spiral paths of the chitinous plating as it climbed higher into the sky. "What do you expect me to say?" He stepped up beside her, his footsteps perfectly aligned with hers. Tap, tap, tap. "I don't expect you to say anything," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I just want you to notice it." "Notice what?" she muttered, not looking at him. "The fact that I'm not afraid anymore? That every step I take feels like it's already been decided for me." Her eyes locked on the spire, and she breathed out slowly. "Yeah," she said softly. "I noticed." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't the awkward kind. It wasn't the kind that needed filling. It was the kind of silence you only feel when there's nothing left to say. Andrew tilted his head, his eyes sharp, thoughtful. That's not what I meant, he said, tapping his fingers slowly against his leg. Tap, tap, tap. Elena's fingers twitched in response. Her hands curled into fists. Then what did you mean? She asked, turning to face him. He didn't answer, not with words. Instead, he raised his hand slowly, deliberately, and pointed toward the edge of the outpost where the valley opened wide. She followed his gaze. Her breath caught in her chest. They were coming. Hundreds of them. Humans. Cliveth. Together. They marched in unison, not as soldiers but as builders. Human engineers carried metal plates, while Cliveth walkers dragged beams of biofused steel. Children walked beside them carrying smaller tools. Not running. Not hiding. Just building. Her throat tightened. Her eyes burned with something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. Do you see it now? Andrew asked, his voice calm, patient, and filled with that unshakable certainty. It's not control. It's not conquest. It's alignment. Her eyes flicked to him, wide with realization. This wasn't a war, she muttered, her voice trembling as it finally clicked. It was a merge. Andrew nodded slowly. Not just a merge, he said, his voice filled with something new. It was contact. Global broadcast, day 11. There were no speeches, no declarations, just the hum. It began with tapping. Tap, tap, tap. Then the voices followed. They came from every corner of the world. From soldiers, from survivors, from Cliveth units who had never spoken a single word in their existence. But now they spoke. The words echoed across every channel, every screen, every speaker. Can you hear us? Do you feel it? You are not alone. It wasn't an order. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. Across every city, every outpost, every home, people stopped what they were doing. Some dropped their tools. Some dropped their weapons. Some simply stood in the street, eyes wide, breaths shallow as they listened. This is not surrender. This is not control. This is something new. There was no fear in the voice. No demand. No threat. You don't have to be afraid anymore. And for the first time in a long, long time, people believed it. Outpost Theta, ground level. Reyes sat on the steps of an old supply depot, his head tilted back as he watched the beacon glow in the distance. His partner, Collins, sat next to him, tossing a small metal bolt in the air, catching it and tossing it again. The Cliveth unit, the one that had been assigned to help them, sat nearby, legs folded like it was meditating. His claws clicked softly against the ground. Tap, tap, tap. Still feels weird, Collins muttered, catching the bolt midair. Knowing it's in there. Knowing it's in me. Reyes didn't answer at first. He just tapped his fingers on the steps. Tap, tap, tap. Does it hurt? He asked after a moment. She glanced at him, frowning. What? The rhythm, he said, looking at her. His eyes weren't glowing, but they had that look to them. That calm, steady certainty she'd seen on the faces of others. Does it hurt? Collins didn't answer. She caught the bolt. Her fingers twitched once. Tap, tap, tap. Her eyes widened. No, she whispered. It doesn't. Outpost Epsilon, Spire Base. Elena stood at the base of the spire, her eyes tracking the glow as it moved in slow, steady pulses. It wasn't just a glow. She could feel it, not on her skin, but in her mind. People are scared, she said quietly. They think they're losing themselves. They're not, Andrew replied, standing beside her, his eyes distant but clear. They're just losing the parts they didn't need anymore. She breathed out slowly, her fingers tapping at her side. Tap, tap, tap. I used to be so scared, she muttered, tilting her head toward him. Of everything. Of you. He didn't flinch. "You're not scared now," he said simply. Her eyes lifted to the glow of the spire. Her fingers tapped in perfect rhythm with the light. "Not of this," she said softly. "Not anymore." She glanced at him. "Do you think it's over?" she asked. Andrew tilted his head, his gaze calm, thoughtful. "No." Her brow furrowed. "Then what is this?" He raised a hand toward the horizon. She followed his gaze and saw it. More dots. Not human. Not Cliveth. Something new. The sky shimmered with faint pulses of light, like distant stars flickering to life. "They heard us," Andrew said softly, his voice filled with quiet awe. "They heard our tap." Her breath hitched. "Who?" she whispered, eyes locked on the horizon. He smiled, his eyes shining with that faint glow, soft and certain. "Everyone. Global broadcast. Final message." The tapping returned. Soft, simple, steady. Tap, tap, tap. It echoed across every device, every screen, every speaker. The glow from the spires pulsed in perfect sync. Then the message came. "You are not alone. We see you. We are waiting." The static faded. The screens went dark. No alarms. No warnings. Just silence. The calm kind. The kind that comes before something new. 312 hours later. The world no longer felt like Earth. Not because it was ruined. Not because it had been conquered. But because it had become something more. Where once there were ruined cities, there were now spires. Not towers. Not bunkers. Beacons. They rose from every major city, every forward operating base, every resistance outpost. They pulsed with soft, rhythmic light, glowing in sync with the heartbeats of every living thing nearby. The air was different now, too. Not in composition, but in weight. There was a pressure, a presence that lingered in every space. You didn't hear it. You didn't see it. You felt it. The hum. The tap. 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 It was always there. Not intrusive. Not loud. It was a rhythm you didn't notice until you realized you were already moving to it. No one questioned it anymore. Not really. Because no one felt alone anymore. Outpost Epsilon Beacon Core. The glow from the spire lit the entire room in waves of soft, pale light. It pulsed like the glow of distant bioluminescent creatures beneath the sea. It didn't flash. It didn't blink. It simply existed. Elena stood at the heart of it all. Her eyes were closed, her breathing steady, her heart perfectly in sync with the pulses of the glow. Her fingers tapped slowly on the metal surface of the console in front of her. Tap, tap, tap. "Where are you right now?" Andrew's voice echoed from somewhere nearby. She opened her eyes. Slowly, deliberately. She looked up and saw him standing at the edge of the room, hands in his coat pockets, his eyes shimmering with that faint, faceted glow. Not sharp, not alien, just present. "I'm here," she said, her voice quieter than she expected. It didn't feel like she was speaking to him. It felt like she was speaking to everything. "You're not," Andrew said softly, taking a step forward. His footsteps didn't echo. They tapped. Tap, tap, tap. "Not all of you." Her eyes flicked toward him, narrowing. "Don't start that again." "It's not a bad thing," he said, tilting his head slightly, his gaze warm but steady. "You're here, and you're everywhere else. All at once." She gritted her teeth, her fingers still tapping the console. "I didn't ask for that." "None of us did," he replied, taking another step toward her. "But it's better than what we had." Her breath came out sharp, her eyes darting back to the glow of the spire. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the polished metal. She could see her face, see her eyes, and behind those eyes, there was something else. She could see it, just barely. the faintest hint of faceted reflections shifting in and out of her pupils. "Is it still me, Andrew?" she asked quietly. Her voice was steady, but her eyes stayed locked on her reflection. "Am I still me?" He stood beside her now, not behind her, not in front of her, beside her. His eyes met hers in the reflection. "Yeah," he said softly, his voice more human than she'd heard in days. "You're still you." Her eyes darted to him. "You sure about that?" He smiled faintly, not the broad grin of confidence. It was the soft, quiet smile of someone who'd seen something terrifying and lived through it. "I know, because I'm still me too." She didn't answer. Her gaze stayed on the reflection of her eyes. "Then why do I see them when I look at myself?" she whispered. Andrew stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder, his fingers gentle, careful. "You're not seeing them," he said quietly. "You're seeing all of us." Her fingers twitched. Her heart ached, but it didn't pound. Tapped. Outpost Theta perimeter wall. Reyes leaned against the wall, chewing on a piece of ration bar that tasted like sawdust but somehow didn't bother him anymore. Across from him, the Cliveth sat in a low, resting posture, its legs folded like it had been meditating for hours. It hadn't spoken, but it didn't need to. "Quiet today," Reyes muttered, tossing a chunk of the ration bar toward the Cliveth. It caught it midair with one claw, inspected it for a moment, then set it down next to itself like it wasn't hungry. "Yeah, thought so," Reyes muttered, tapping his fingers on the side of his rifle. Tap, tap, tap. The Cliveth tilted its head, watching him. "You ever wonder what's next?" he asked, not looking at it. "Like, what happens after this? No war, no orders, no generals barking at you. What's the point after that?" The Cliveth didn't answer. It just raised one clawed arm and tapped it softly against the wall. Tap, tap, tap. Reyes stared at it for a moment. He didn't smile. He didn't laugh. He just watched. "Yeah," he muttered, wiping crumbs off his hands. "Guess you feel it too." The Cliveth tilted its head further, eyes shifting as it focused directly on him. "You feel it too." The words weren't spoken aloud. They didn't have to be. Global transmission, day 13. There was no static this time. No emergency broadcast sirens. Just tapping. Tap, tap, tap. Then, the voice returned. Calm, patient. "We see you. Every speaker. Every radio. Every comms unit. Every mind. You feel it now, don't you?" The pause was long but steady. The glow from the spires pulsed in perfect sync. "This is not surrender. This is not control. This is connection." There was a shift. Not in the air. Not in sound. It was something deeper. Something internal. People felt it in their breath, their hearts, their fingers tapping at their sides. This is not a loss. This is not an end. This is a beginning, and then the most unexpected message of all. We are not alone. The message lingered for a moment longer. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the signal faded. But the tapping didn't stop. Outpost Epsilon 3 hours later. Elena stood outside the spire now, staring up at its impossible height. She felt it in every part of her body. The hum, the glow, the rhythm. She felt them. Her fingers twitched. Andrew stood beside her, silent, his gaze on the horizon. He wasn't looking at the spire. He was looking up. "You feel it too, don't you?" Elena asked, her voice barely a whisper. Andrew nodded slowly. Her eyes followed his, squinting as she focused on the horizon. She didn't see it at first. Just blue sky. But then, something flickered. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, a glint of sun off distant clouds. But it moved. No, not moved. Shifted. She tilted her head. Her breath caught in her chest. "What is that?" she asked, her voice tight with something she hadn't felt in days. "Another signal," Andrew said, his voice layered with quiet awe. "They're answering." Her heart slowed. Her fingers twitched once more. Tap, tap, tap. Her eyes stayed on the shimmering point in the distance. It grew brighter, larger, closer. Her eyes darted to Andrew, wide with realization. "It's not them, is it?" Andrew smiled softly. His gaze filled with that quiet certainty that she had come to fear and trust in equal measure. "No," he said, his eyes tracking the faint shimmer. "It's someone else." The glow in the sky grew brighter. She took a slow, steady breath. "What do we do now?" she asked. Andrew's eyes flicked to hers. His smile widened. "We meet them." Her fingers twitched. Her heart tapped. Her breath synced. Her mind quieted. Tap, tap, tap. Her gaze locked on the glow in the sky, growing larger with every passing second. Her eyes stayed open this time. She was not afraid. "All right," she whispered, her face calm as the glow consumed the sky. "Let's meet them." 336 hours later. The glow in the sky hadn't gone away. For days, it hovered there like a second sun just beyond the atmosphere. It wasn't blinding. It wasn't searing. It was a soft, steady pulse. The same rhythm that had echoed in every mind, every outpost, every spire across the planet. Tap, tap, tap. It never stopped. Not even for a second. By now, people didn't fight it. They moved with it. Every human, every cliveth, every soldier, every child, every worker, and now everyone else. Because the glow wasn't just above anymore. It was coming down. Outpost Epsilon, the beacon courtyard. Elena stood at the base of the spire, her eyes locked on the sky. Her breath was steady, her heart calm, her hands still at her sides. Her fingers didn't twitch anymore. They didn't have to. The rhythm was in her now. Andrew stood beside her, hands in his coat pockets, his eyes reflecting the glow from above. His gaze wasn't filled with fear. It wasn't filled with uncertainty. He just watched. "They're not slowing down," Elena said quietly, tilting her head as she tracked the glow descending from the sky. It wasn't falling like a meteor. It wasn't moving with the violence of a re-entry burn. It was gliding, smooth, purposeful, precise. "No," Andrew said softly, his breath misting faintly in the air. "They've been waiting long enough." Her eyes flicked toward him. "You're too calm about this." "I could say the same about you," he replied with a smile. She didn't respond to that. Because he was right. She was calm. She should be terrified. She should be screaming at every soldier on the outpost to man the turrets, to aim the guns, to prepare for another war. But no one was screaming. No alarms blared. No klaxons. Just the hum. And the tap. 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 Elena exhaled slowly, watching the glow as it passed through the clouds, soft beams of light refracting through the vapor. It wasn't fire. It wasn't destruction. It was arrival. "Do you know who it is?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She kept her gaze on the light, her fingers tapping once, twice, 3 times against the side of her leg. Tap, tap, tap. "I have a guess," Andrew replied, tilting his head slightly, his eyes glowing faintly with that faceted shimmer. "And," she asked, her eyes flicking toward him. He glanced at her, his eyes calm, his breath steady, his fingers tapping softly on his coat sleeve. Tap, tap, tap. "They heard us," he said simply. Global broadcast, day 14. The tapping didn't start this time. It was already there. No static. No emergency tones. Just the steady, unyielding rhythm. And this time, the voice wasn't human. It wasn't Cliveth either. "We see you." The voice wasn't layered like before. It wasn't a blend of human and Cliveth voices. It was something else entirely. It was new, soft, resonant, familiar but alien, like hearing a song from a dream you'd forgotten until you heard it again. "We hear you." The world froze. Every soldier, every worker, every child, every Cliveth. They all stopped. They all listened. "You are not alone." The message echoed across every channel, but it wasn't a broadcast. It was a presence. The hum grew louder. The taps grew stronger. Every spire pulsed in unison. And for the first time in weeks, it wasn't their rhythm anymore. It was ours. Outpost Zulu Courtyard. Reyes stood with his hands on his hips, his eyes locked on the glow descending from the sky. His partner, Collins, stood next to him, leaning on her rifle like it was a walking stick. "That's not a drop pod," Collins muttered, squinting against the glow. "Too slow." "Yeah," Reyes replied, his voice quiet, calm. "It's not a pod." Collins glanced at him, eyes narrowing. "Don't tell me you know what it is." He shrugged. "Don't have to." Her eyes stayed on him for a moment longer. "You always do that, you know." "Do what?" "That," she muttered, pointing at him with the barrel of her rifle. "That whole I already knew this was gonna happen routine. Drives me nuts." Reyes chuckled, his eyes never leaving the sky. His fingers tapped softly on his thigh. Tap, tap, tap. "Does it drive you nuts?" he asked. "Or are you just mad you're feeling it too?" Collins opened her mouth to argue but stopped. Her fingers twitched. Her breath slowed. Her tapping started. Tap, tap, tap. Her eyes darted to her hand like it had betrayed her. She looked at Reyes, her face tense, lips pressed into a thin line. "Yeah," he muttered, nodding to himself. "I know." Outpost Epsilon Beacon Base. The light had arrived. It hovered just above the ground, silent, radiant, and absolutely still. It wasn't a ship. It had no thrusters, no engines, no exhaust. It didn't burn. It didn't shake. It just hung there, softly pulsing with the glow of the spire behind them. The glow mirrored the hum of the world. Elena and Andrew stood in front of it, eyes locked on the floating light. It wasn't blinding. It wasn't harsh. It was soft, like lantern light through paper. She took a step forward, slowly, carefully. Her heart didn't pound. Tapped, tap, tap, tap. Her breath followed it. Her fingers moved in rhythm with it. "Is it alive?" she asked quietly, her eyes scanning it like it might lash out. "Everything's alive if you know how to listen," Andrew replied. His gaze locked on the glow. Her fingers twitched again. Her heart tapped. Her breath tapped. Her mind tapped. The glow shifted. It wasn't fast. It wasn't sharp. It moved like a thought taking shape, an idea becoming clear. The light twisted. It unfolded. Like petals of a flower, its shape bent outward, layer by layer, revealing something inside. Elena's eyes widened. Her heart skipped. "Andrew," she whispered, her voice low, her breath sharp. "I know," he said quietly. Inside the glow was a form, not a human, not a Cliveth, not like anything she'd ever seen. The figure had limbs, but they weren't arms or legs. They were soft, shifting tendrils of light, bending like strands of silk caught in slow motion. Its body was fluid, like glass moving in slow ripples. No face, no eyes, just an outline of something aware. It stepped forward. No sound, no threat, just presence. Elena didn't move. Andrew didn't flinch. The figure's tendrils hovered near Elena's face, close enough that she could feel warmth. Her breathing slowed. Her eyes stayed on it, wide but steady. Her fingers didn't twitch. Tap, tap, tap. It tilted its head, if it even had a head. The shape shifted like liquid adjusting itself. Its tendrils hovered near Elena's chest, inches from her heart. "Can you hear it?" she whispered, her breath barely audible. The figure pulsed with a soft glow. Then, like an answer to a question she didn't realize she'd asked, it tapped against the air. Tap, tap, tap. Elena's breath caught in her chest. Her fingers rose slowly, her heart steady. Her hand hovered in front of the glow, her fingertips inches from its tendrils. Her eyes met Andrew's. "Do it," he said softly. Her fingers pressed forward, slow, deliberate. The glow shifted, tapped against her fingers. Tap, tap, tap. Her mind opened. Her breath stopped. Her heart skipped. Her mind was no longer her own. It was theirs. Her breath returned, slow, steady, and in perfect sync. Her eyes opened, faceted reflections. Her lips parted, her voice calm, distant, but clear. "They've been waiting too." The glow pulsed in sync with her heart. Her fingers tapped. Tap, tap, tap. Her smile was slow but sure. "Now we meet them." 384 hours later. The sky was no longer empty. It wasn't clouds. It wasn't stars. It wasn't the faint glow of distant satellites. It was something more. Shapes moved in orbit. Not ships. Not fleets. Not anything humanity had words for. They didn't burn. They didn't spin. They didn't fall. They hovered, like distant lanterns floating on the edge of reality. They shimmered with faint pulses of light. Their surfaces weren't metallic or organic. They were something in between, smooth, fluid, and constantly shifting, like ripples on a pond. They pulsed to the same, familiar rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Across the world, people stopped and looked up. No one ran. No one screamed. They just watched. Their breaths matched the rhythm. Their hearts did too. Tap, tap, tap. Outpost Epsilon Beacon Courtyard. Elena stood at the base of the spire, head tilted up, her eyes locked on the sky. Her pupils had changed. They weren't just hers anymore. Faceted reflections glinted in her eyes like shards of glass catching the sun. Her fingers tapped lightly against her leg. Tap, tap, tap. She didn't realize she was doing it anymore. It was natural, instinctive. Andrew stood next to her, hands in his coat pockets, his eyes on the largest of the shapes slowly descending from the sky. It wasn't fast. It wasn't violent. It simply arrived, like it had always been there. His fingers tapped on the fabric of his coat. Tap, tap, tap. "Do you hear it?" Elena asked, her eyes never leaving the sky. "I hear it," Andrew replied softly, his gaze steady, clear and certain. "They've been waiting for this longer than we have." Her lips pressed into a thin line. Her fingers stopped tapping for a moment. Her gaze flicked to him, searching for something, doubt, maybe. She didn't find it. "Waiting for what?" she asked, tilting her head. He glanced at her, his eyes soft but unwavering. "For us to understand." Her throat tightened. She wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Her fingers started tapping again without her thinking about it. Tap, tap, tap. She took a breath, deep and slow. Her heart was calm, too calm. Her eyes flicked toward the crowd behind them. Soldiers, civilians, Cliveth drones, workers, children. They all stood there, gazing upward, their faces glowing in the light of the spire. No panic, no fear, just quiet awe. No one held a gun anymore. No one needed to. Her eyes went back to Andrew. "You're too calm about this," she said, repeating her old words. "You always are." He gave her that same quiet smile, the one that didn't have to prove anything. The one that said, "You'll see it soon enough." "Would it help if I was afraid?" he asked, his eyes meeting hers. "Would that make it better?" Her gaze dropped to the ground. She didn't answer right away. Her fingers tapped against her leg. Tap, tap, tap. "No," she muttered finally. "No, I guess it wouldn't." Her eyes lifted back to the sky, to the largest shape descending through the atmosphere. It was close now. Not a ship, not a drone. It had no thrusters, no visible engines, no weapon ports. It was smooth. It didn't look like something designed. It looked like something grown. The glow of the spire behind her pulsed at the same rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Her breath synced with it. Her pulse synced with it. Her mind synced with it. "Is this where it happens?" she asked softly, eyes locked on the descending glow. Her voice was tight, barely above a whisper. Andrew didn't answer right away. He stared up at the sky, his eyes reflecting the glow like twin mirrors. "It's already happening," he replied. "It's been happening for a while now." Her hands twitched. Her heart tapped. Her breath synced. Her gaze turned toward him, sharp. "Did you know it would end like this?" He raised an eyebrow. "End?" Her lips parted, confusion flickering in her eyes. "You think this is an end?" Andrew asked, his voice calm but firm. He turned to face her fully, his eyes locked on hers. Faceted reflections. "Elena, this isn't an end. This is the part where we finally start." Global broadcast, day 16. No alarms. No sirens. No warnings. No preamble. Just the hum. It echoed through every channel, every speaker, every line of communication on Earth. No static. No distortions. Only the hum. The tap. The signal. Tap, tap, tap. Then, the voice returned. It wasn't one voice. It wasn't our voice. It was theirs. "We see you." Every head turned toward the sky. "We hear you." The glow of every spire pulsed in perfect sync. "You are not alone." No one moved. No one dared. "We come to understand." The broadcast ended, but the tapping did not. Tap, tap, tap. Every spire on the planet pulsed at the same time, every glow perfectly in sync with the faint lights drifting down from orbit. They weren't coming. They were already here. Outpost Theta perimeter wall. Reyes sat on the edge of the wall, arms draped over his knees, eyes locked on the sky. Collins sat beside him, chewing on a piece of ration bar, her gaze distant but steady. "That's not a fleet," Collins muttered, tossing a chunk of the ration bar toward the ground. "Not ships. I thought it'd be ships." "Yeah," Reyes muttered, his eyes focused on the largest of the incoming shapes. "I thought so too." He didn't know why, but seeing them up there didn't scare him. The glow didn't feel threatening. It didn't feel like something above them. Felt like something with them. He tapped his fingers on the metal railing of the wall. Tap, tap, tap. He didn't realize he was doing it until Collins tapped her fingers on her knee in response. Tap, tap, tap. Her eyes flicked to him. She opened her mouth like she was about to say something, but the words didn't come. Her gaze shifted back to the sky. Her heart tapped. Her breath synced. Her fingers tapped in time. Tap, tap, tap. She didn't argue. She didn't question it anymore. Outpost Epsilon landing zone. The glow had arrived. The large, fluid form hovered a few meters off the ground, its edges rippling like liquid glass. It didn't shake. It didn't hum. It simply existed. Its glow pulsed with the beat of the spire behind it. Tap, tap, tap. Elena stood in front of it, her breath slow, her eyes steady. Andrew stood at her side, silent but present. The glow shifted, not like a machine, not like a drone. It unfolded, slowly, deliberately, like the petals of a flower opening toward the sun. A figure stepped out. It wasn't human. It wasn't Cliveth. It wasn't them. It was something new. Its form shimmered as it moved forward, tendrils of light folding into itself like fluid silk. No eyes, no face, no hard lines. It didn't need them. His body shifted as it moved, forming and reforming with every step. It stopped in front of Elena. Her fingers tapped once, twice, 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. The being tilted its head. Then it tapped back. Tap, tap, tap. Her breath hitched in her chest. Her eyes flickered with a spark of realization. They knew the rhythm. They'd always known it. "Do you understand us?" she asked, her voice barely more than a breath. The being tilted its head. Its glow shifted, its tendrils curling toward her like waves reaching for shore. "We see you. We hear you. We feel you." Her breath came slow. Her eyes didn't blink. "Then come with us," she whispered, her voice clear, steady, and stronger than it had ever been. "Show us what comes next." The glow brightened. Her eyes didn't look away. Her breath synced. Her heart synced. Her mind opened. Her smile was slow, certain. Tap, tap, tap. "All right," she whispered, as the glow enveloped her. "Let's meet them." 408 hours later. The world was no longer just Earth. The shapes in the sky hadn't left. They hovered in low orbit, their soft, pulsing light visible even during the day. At night, the sky shimmered as though every star had descended closer to watch. They weren't invaders. They weren't conquerors. They were observers. Every spire on the planet glowed brighter now, its pulses perfectly aligned with the objects above. The hum wasn't a sound anymore. It was everywhere. It vibrated in the metal of rebuilt structures. It resonated in the bones of every living thing. It wasn't oppressive. It wasn't intrusive. It was connection. Outpost Epsilon Spire Core. Elena stood in the heart of the spire, surrounded by the softly glowing walls that seemed to pulse with life. The air was warm, alive, almost electric. She could feel it against her skin, in her lungs, in her chest. The faceted shimmer in her eyes had grown stronger. It wasn't human anymore, but it wasn't alien either. It was both. Andrew stood across from her, his hands clasped behind his back. His gaze was calm, steady, but something in his posture had shifted. He didn't look like a soldier anymore. He looked like someone who had found purpose. "We're not alone anymore," she said softly, her voice carrying through the room even though she barely spoke above a whisper. "That's what you've been trying to tell me this whole time." Andrew nodded, his expression warm but unreadable. "You always knew it. You just didn't want to believe it." Her fingers tapped against the console in front of her. Tap, tap, tap. Her eyes drifted to the central chamber of the spire, where the glowing form of the alien being hovered in silence. It hadn't moved since it arrived. It simply existed, its tendrils of light flowing in slow, deliberate patterns. "Do they speak to you?" she asked, her voice steady but curious. Andrew tilted his head slightly, a small smile forming on his lips. "Not the way we think of speaking. They don't need words." Elena exhaled, her breath syncing with the rhythm of the spire. Her heart did the same. Her tapping fingers stopped, but the rhythm continued in her mind. Tap, tap, tap. "They're waiting for us to catch up, aren't they?" she asked, looking back at him. Andrew's smile widened. "They've been waiting for a long time." Global broadcast, day 17. The tapping began again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, the voice wasn't layered. It wasn't a chorus of human and Cliveth tones. It was singular, resonant, and unmistakably new. "We see you. We hear you. We are here to learn." The message echoed across the planet. Every spire pulsed brighter, their rhythms perfectly aligned with the objects in orbit. The lights in the sky grew stronger, casting faint shadows on the ground below. We are not your enemies. We are not your saviors. We are your reflection. The transmission ended as quickly as it began. But the tapping continued. Outpost Theta perimeter wall. Reyes leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching the horizon. The spire in the distance glowed brighter than it ever had, its light casting soft shadows across the ground. Collins sat nearby, her rifle leaning against the wall beside her. She didn't hold it. She hadn't needed to in days. "You think they're telling the truth?" she asked, breaking the silence. Reyes didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on the spire, his fingers tapping softly against his thigh. Tap, tap, tap. "About what?" he asked. "About not being saviors," she said, her tone skeptical. "Feels like that's what they're doing, doesn't it?" He shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe they're just showing us what we could have been." Her fingers twitched. Tap, tap, tap. She frowned, glancing down at her hand like it was moving without her permission. "You ever stop tapping?" "Nope," he replied with a faint smile. "Why would I?" Collins rolled her eyes but didn't argue. She glanced back at the spire, her breath sinking with its glow. Tap, tap, tap. Outpost Epsilon courtyard. The alien figure moved for the first time. Elena watched in silence as its glowing tendrils shifted, folding and unfolding like waves of light. It didn't have a face, but somehow she could feel it looking at her. Her fingers twitched at her side. Tap, tap, tap. It moved closer, its tendrils hovering inches from her chest. She didn't step back. She didn't flinch. She just watched. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice steady. The figure didn't respond with words. Instead, it raised one glowing tendril and tapped gently against the air between them. Tap, tap, tap. Her breath caught. Her heart skipped. She raised her hand, slowly, deliberately, and tapped her fingers against her chest in response. Tap, tap, tap. The figure pulsed with light, brighter than before. It didn't feel overwhelming, felt welcoming. For the first time since it arrived, she heard it speak. Not aloud, not in her mind. It spoke through the rhythm. "Do you understand now?" Her breath steadied. Her heart synced. Her mind opened. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling with something between awe and certainty. "I think I do." The figure pulsed again, its tendrils folding into themselves, retreating back toward the glow of the spire. "Where does it end?" Elena asked softly, her voice barely audible. Andrew stepped beside her, his gaze calm, his hands at his sides. "It doesn't." Her eyes flicked toward him. "Then what happens next?" His smile widened, his fingers tapping once more. Tap, tap, tap. "Now," he said, turning his gaze back to the sky. The shimmering shapes above pulsed in perfect sync with the spire's glow. "Now we take the next step." 432 hours later. The shapes in the sky no longer seemed foreign. They weren't just objects anymore. They were part of the rhythm, part of the hum that resonated through every spire, every structure, every living being. They pulsed softly, their light like a beacon calling out not to conquer, but to connect. The world below wasn't the same either. Cities weren't being rebuilt the way they had been. The old architecture, the old ways of thinking no longer fit. New structures rose, blending metal and organic materials seamlessly, like living organisms designed to shelter, to protect, to unify. The rhythm was everywhere. Tap, tap, tap. Outpost Epsilon Beacon Nexus. Elena stood at the edge of the spire's central chamber, staring into the vast open space within. It pulsed softly, the walls glowing with the same iridescent shimmer as the objects above. Tendrils of light weaved through the air, connecting terminals, platforms, and floating orbs of unknown energy. The alien figure stood in the center of it all. It didn't move often. It didn't need to. Its presence alone seemed to shift the air, to ripple through the glow of the spire. "Do you ever wonder why it's us?" Elena asked softly, her voice carrying through the chamber even though she wasn't speaking loudly. "Why they came here of all places?" Andrew stood beside her, arms crossed, his gaze steady on the figure. His faceted eyes caught the light, shimmering faintly. "They didn't come to us," he said. "They heard us." Elena turned to face him, her brow furrowing. "What does that mean? Heard us? We didn't send out a message. We weren't asking for this." Andrew tilted his head slightly, his expression calm but thoughtful. "We didn't need to send a message. They felt us through the rhythm." Her lips pressed into a thin line. She wanted to argue, but the tapping in her fingers stopped her. Tap, tap, tap. "Do you know what they're going to do next?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Her eyes flicked toward the alien figure, its glowing tendrils weaving slowly through the air. Andrew smiled faintly, shaking his head. "No," she frowned. "That doesn't bother you?" "No," he replied simply, "because it's not about what they're going to do next." "Then what is it about?" she asked, stepping closer to him. His faceted eyes met hers, steady and unwavering. "It's about what we're going to do next." Global broadcast, day 18. The hum returned, softer this time, like a whisper carried on the wind. The tapping followed, steady and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Then the voice came through. It wasn't alien anymore. It wasn't human either. It was both. "We have learned. We have seen. Now we ask, will you take the next step?" The broadcast ended as quietly as it began. No demands, no threats, just the question carried on the rhythm. "Outpost Theta perimeter wall." Reyes sat on the wall, his legs dangling over the edge, staring up at the sky. The largest of the objects hovered directly above the outpost now, its glow reflecting off the ground below. Collins sat beside him, her rifle leaning against her shoulder. She wasn't gripping it. She hadn't needed to in days. Her fingers tapped lightly against the steel of the wall. Tap, tap, tap. "That's new," she muttered, nodding toward the glowing object above. "Closer than it was yesterday." "Yeah," Reyes replied, his tone calm but thoughtful. "They're waiting." She glanced at him, one eyebrow raised. "For what?" "For us," he said simply, his fingers mirroring her rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. She frowned, her gaze shifting back to the object. "You think they're going to just invite us up there?" "Maybe," Reyes said with a faint grin. "Would you say no?" Her lips twitched, but she didn't smile. "You're way too comfortable with this." "Yeah," he admitted, his grin widening. "I am." Outpost Epsilon Beacon Base. The alien figure stepped forward, its tendrils folding and unfolding in slow, deliberate patterns. Elena watched as it moved closer, her heart calm, her breath steady. The glow of the spire pulsed in sync with its movements. Tap, tap, tap. "What do you want us to do?" she asked, her voice steady but quiet. The figure tilted its head, if it had a head, and extended one glowing tendril toward her. It didn't touch her. It stopped inches from her chest, hovering there, pulsing softly. The rhythm grew louder. Elena's fingers twitched. Tap, tap, tap. Then, for the first time since it arrived, the figure spoke directly. Not in words, not in thoughts, in feelings. She felt it in her chest, in her mind, in every nerve of her body. "Step forward." Her breath hitched. Her heart tapped once, twice, 3 times. She glanced at Andrew. His expression was calm, his fingers tapping at his side. "Go on," he said softly, nodding toward the figure. "You're ready." Her gaze shifted back to the figure, its light brighter now, more intense but still warm. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping closer. The figure's tendrils shifted, curling gently around her without touching her. The light enveloped her, filling her vision, her thoughts, her entire being. And then she saw it. The rhythm wasn't just Earth's. It wasn't just human. It wasn't just Cliveth. It was everywhere. She saw stars pulsing in perfect sync, nebulae glowing with faint, rhythmic light, entire galaxies moving to the same beat. Tap, tap, tap. Her breath caught as the figure's voice resonated through her mind, calm and infinite. "This is only the beginning." Global broadcast, day 19. The tapping returned. Louder, stronger, unstoppable. Tap, tap, tap. Then the voice came again, carried by the rhythm. "Will you come with us? Will you learn what lies beyond?" The question lingered, resonating through every spire, every being. And this time, there was no hesitation. The world answered, yes. The rhythm grew louder, echoing through the air, the ground, the stars. Tap, tap, tap. And the light from the sky descended once more. This time it wasn't just watching. It was inviting. The spires pulsed one last time, their glow syncing with the shapes above. The hum that had resonated across Earth grew quieter, softer, like a song reaching its final note. Elena stood at the base of the spire, her breath steady, her heart calm. Around her, soldiers, civilians, and Cliveth alike stood shoulder to shoulder, all watching the light descending from the sky. It wasn't blinding. It wasn't terrifying. It was inviting. Andrew stepped forward, his faceted eyes shimmering softly as he glanced at Elena. He nodded once, silently telling her it was time. She didn't hesitate. The figure of light that had emerged from the spire extended its tendrils toward her, not as a command, but as an offering. Elena raised her hand, her fingers trembling slightly before they steadied. She reached out. The moment her hand touched the light, the world seemed to stop. No, not stop. It shifted. The air around her shimmered. The ground beneath her feet felt weightless. The spire, the outpost, the shapes in the sky, all of it blurred, twisted, folded into something incomprehensible yet strangely familiar. Elena's mind opened wider than it ever had before. She saw everything, not just Earth, not just the Cliveth. She saw stars being born, galaxies colliding, entire civilizations rising and falling in the endless rhythm of the cosmos. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm wasn't Earth's. It wasn't humanity's. It wasn't Cliveth. It was universal. And then the light spoke, not in words, not in thoughts, in understanding. "The choice is yours." Elena gasped softly, her breath catching in her throat. She looked back, her gaze falling on the people behind her. Human and Cliveth, all watching her with wide eyes, their hearts beating in perfect sync with the rhythm. Her fingers tightened around the tendrils of light. "We're ready," she said, her voice clear, steady, filled with certainty. "Take us forward." The light pulsed brighter, the rhythm growing stronger, faster, until it filled every corner of the planet. The spires glowed like beacons, their light reaching up toward the shapes in the sky. And then it all connected. The shapes descended, merging with the spires. The rhythm echoed through every person, every building, every inch of the planet. Elena felt herself lift, not physically, but mentally. Her thoughts expanded, her consciousness reaching out, touching not just Earth, but everything beyond. She saw them, the ones who had sent the shapes, the ones who had been waiting, not conquerors, not saviors, explorers. They weren't here to lead. They were here to walk beside. The final pulse of the spire resonated across the globe. Every light on Earth went dark for a single breathless moment. When the light returned, everything was different. The camera pans upward, showing the Earth from orbit. The glowing shapes are no longer above the planet. Instead, they've merged into the spires, forming intricate lattices of light that extend into space, connecting the planet to the stars. A faint hum lingers in the background. Tap, tap, tap. Elena's voice echoes in the darkness, calm, resolute. We are not alone. We never were. The stars pulse in the rhythm. The screen fades to black. Tap, 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 and then silence.